Everyone knows royal families marry their cousins, but what if I told you some were more inbred than children born to siblings? Jaws that couldn't close, tongues too big for mouths, kings who couldn't walk until age 8. These are the 10 most inbred royals in history, ranked by how damaged they actually were. And number 1, you've never heard of her. Royal 10, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Victoria and Albert were first cousins, same grandmother. When they married in 1840, nobody cared. This was normal for royals, expected even. They had 9 children. Victoria herself was fine, mentally sharp, ruled for 63 years, but she carried something hidden in her blood, hemophilia. It's a disorder that stops blood from clotting. A small cut can make you bleed for hours. A bruise can fill with blood that never stops pooling. Victoria passed the mutation to 3 of her children, her son Leopold, who had it, and 2 daughters, Alice and Beatrice, who were carriers. Leopold died at 30 from a fall, a minor tumble. The bleeding in his brain wouldn't stop. Alice and Beatrice married into royal families across Europe, Russia, Spain, Germany. The mutation went with them. Victoria's great-grandson Alexei was heir to the Russian throne. He had it bad. Couldn't play like normal children. A bumped knee could leave him bedridden for weeks. His parents got so desperate they brought in a Siberian peasant named Rasputin to pray over him. Rasputin gained massive influence over the royal family. That decision helped destabilize the entire Russian government before the revolution. 2 Spanish princes bled to death decades later. Minor car accidents, not the crashes that killed them, the bleeding afterwards. Victoria's inbreeding didn't damage her directly. It damaged everyone her bloodline touched for the next century. Royal 9, George III. George III came from the House of Hanover, German royals who married German royals for generations. His parents were second cousins. Their parents were cousins too. He became King of Britain in 1760 at age 22, ruled for 60 years. For the first 3 decades, he was fine. Then he lost his mind. In 1788, George started acting strange, talking for hours without stopping, foaming at the mouth, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop moving. He had episodes for the rest of his life. During the bad ones, they put him in a straitjacket, dunked him in ice baths, strapped him to chairs. By 1810, he was gone completely, blind, deaf, talking to people who weren't there. His son had to run the country. George spent his last 10 years locked in Windsor Castle, didn't recognize his own family, walked the halls in a purple bathrobe having conversations with the dead. What caused it? Doctors still argue. Some say a blood disease called porphyria. Recent research suggests bipolar disorder. Either way, his family's inbreeding likely contributed. He also lost America, but that's another story. Royal 8, Maria I of Portugal. Maria married her uncle, her father's brother. She was 25, he was 42. This wasn't shocking in 1760. Keep the throne in the family. The Pope gave permission. Maria became Queen of Portugal in 1777, first queen to rule the country in her own right. Smart, capable, she built churches, fixed the legal system, and ran things well for over a decade. Then her husband died, then her son died, then her confessor died. 3 deaths in 2 years. She lost her mind. Servants heard her screaming through the palace walls at night. She believed she was going to hell, said she could see her dead father burning. Sometimes she wouldn't eat for days. By 1792, they declared her unfit to rule. Her son took over. Maria spent her last 24 years locked away. When Napoleon invaded Portugal in 1807, they had to carry her onto the ship. She had no idea where she was going. She died in Rio in 1816. Still insane. Royal 7, Isabella II of Spain. Isabella's parents were uncle and niece. Her father, Ferdinand VII, married his own brother's daughter. Isabella became queen at age 3. At 16, they married her to her cousin Francisco. Double first cousin. Their fathers were brothers. Their mothers were sisters. The marriage failed immediately. Francisco wanted nothing to do with her. Rumors said he couldn't consummate the marriage. Spain needed an heir. Francisco couldn't deliver. So Isabella found other men, generals, musicians. She didn't hide it. 12 pregnancies, 5 children survived. Francisco was probably the father of none of them. By 1868, Spain had enough. Revolution kicked Isabella off the throne. She ran to Paris, never came back. Royal 6, Margaret Teresa of Spain. You've seen her face. The little blonde girl in the famous painting Las Meninas. Velázquez painted her at age 5. She looks healthy, normal. She wasn't. Margaret Teresa's parents were uncle and niece. Her father, Philip IV, married his sister's daughter. By the time Margaret was born, 4 generations of Habsburgs had married their own relatives. At 15, they shipped her to Vienna to marry Emperor Leopold I. her uncle. She called him uncle during the wedding because that's what he was. Then came the pregnancies. 6 and 6 years. Her body couldn't handle it. First child died at 3 months. Third died within hours. Fourth died at 2 weeks. Then 2 miscarriages. 1 child out of 6 survived. Margaret's health collapsed. She died at 21, still pregnant, married to her uncle, 5 dead children. Her only surviving daughter, Maria Antonia, will show up later in this list. Royal 5, Ferdinand I of Austria. Ferdinand's parents were double first cousins, same 4 grandparents on both sides of the family tree. He was born in 1793 with a head too large for his body, fluid built up in his skull, hydrocephalus, he had epilepsy, up to 20 seizures a day. But he was the eldest son, so they made him emperor anyway. Ferdinand became Emperor of Austria in 1835. He couldn't rule, couldn't follow conversations, couldn't make decisions. A council of advisors ran the empire while Ferdinand sat on the throne and smiled. He caught flies and put them in jars. He rolled himself across the floor in waste paper baskets. Servants tried to stop him. He threw tantrums. One day the kitchen told him he couldn't have apricot dumplings because apricots were out of season. He shouted, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." That was Ferdinand, Emperor of Austria, fighting his own kitchen for dumplings. When revolution hit Europe in 1848, his advisors told him to give up the crown. Ferdinand agreed. He probably didn't understand what was happening. He lived another 27 years after that, by all accounts happy, no stress, no responsibilities. Royal 4, Don Carlos of Spain. Don Carlos should have had 8 great-grandparents. He had 4. His parents were double first cousins. His inbreeding coefficient reached 21%. He was born in 1545. Problems started early. His head was too big. One shoulder sat higher than the other. One leg shorter. He didn't talk until he was 5. As he got older, things got worse. Don Carlos was violent. He beat servants for small mistakes. Contemporary accounts describe him roasting animals alive. He tried to stab people, attacked a duke with a knife. In 1568, his father Philip II gave up. He had his own son arrested in the middle of the night, locked him in a room in the palace. No trial, no announcement. Don Carlos died 6 months later, age 23. Official cause was a fever. Nobody knows what really happened in that room. His father never spoke about it again. Royal 3, Charles II of Spain. Charles II is the face of royal inbreeding, the one everyone talks about. His parents were uncle and niece. His family tree is so tangled, scientists still study it today. His inbreeding coefficient was 25.4%, higher than children born to siblings. He was born in 1661. The problems showed up immediately. Charles couldn't breastfeed properly. He needed 14 wet nurses working in rotation to keep him alive. He didn't walk until age 8, didn't talk clearly ever. His jaw was so oversized his teeth didn't meet. He drooled constantly. His body never worked right, constant stomach problems, weak bones. He looked decades older than he was. Doctors at the time blamed witchcraft. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. They performed exorcisms. Didn't help. Charles became king of Spain at age 4. He ruled for 35 years. Never really ruled anything. His 2 wives tried for years to produce an heir. Nothing worked. His autopsy revealed 1 shriveled testicle, completely black. He died in 1700. Age 38. No children. The Spanish Habsburg line died with him. The fight over his throne started a war that killed over 1 million people. 13 years of bloodshed because one inbred king couldn't produce an heir. But here's the thing. Charles II wasn't the most inbred, not even close. Royal 2, Alfonso XII of Spain. Alfonso XII was more inbred than Charles II on paper, 25%. His parents were double first cousins. He should have been a mess. He wasn't. Alfonso was born in 1857, grew up healthy, normal, handsome. He could walk, talk, think, rule, married twice and had 5 children. How does a king more inbred than Charles II turn out fine? Simple. His father probably wasn't his father. Remember Isabella II? The queen who had affairs because her inbred husband couldn't perform? Alfonso was her son. Officially, his father was Francisco. But everyone at court knew the truth. Isabella had lovers. A captain in the royal guard. Any of them could have been Alfonso's real father. If his real father was someone outside the family, those numbers mean nothing. Alfonso died young anyway. Tuberculosis at 27, nothing to do with inbreeding. The numbers lied. Royal 1, Maria Antonia of Austria. Remember Margaret Teresa, the girl from Las Meninas who died at 21? Maria Antonia was her only surviving child. Her father was Leopold I, her mother's uncle, so Maria Antonia's parents were uncle and niece. But that's not what made her the most inbred royal in history. Both her parents were already heavily inbred before they married each other. Leopold came from generations of Habsburg cousin marriages. Margaret Theresa came from the same family. When they had a child, the inbreeding compounded. Maria Antonia hit 30.5%, higher than Charles II, higher than anyone else in European royal records. She was born in 1669, weak from the start, but she survived childhood, got married at 15, had 3 children, 2 died young. Her one surviving son was Joseph Ferdinand. He became heir to the Spanish throne after Charles II couldn't produce children. For a moment, it looked like he would unite 2 empires. Then Joseph Ferdinand died, age 6, sudden illness. That death changed everything. The great powers of Europe went to war over who would get Spain. The War of Spanish Succession lasted 13 years. Maria Antonia herself died in 1692, age 23. Just like her mother, 2 generations of women, dead before 25, worn out by the same poisoned bloodline. The most inbred royal in European history, and nobody remembers her name. And no, it's not King Charles III. He's only around 4% inbred, nothing compared to this list.
The Romanovs. The Romanov dynasty is often remembered for its violent end, a basement in Yekaterinburg, a firing squad, the extinction of 3 centuries of Russian imperial rule in a single night. But the biological story of the family is just as dramatic, and it started long before the revolution came. By the 19th century, the Romanovs had settled into a pattern common to nearly every royal house in Europe. Marriage within an extraordinarily narrow pool of approved Protestant German noble families. The same surname cycling through the genealogy across generations until the family tree looked less like a branching structure and more like a braid. Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra were third cousins through their shared ancestor Queen Victoria of England, which sounds distant enough until you consider that virtually every match made in that family for 100 years prior operated at a similar or closer degree of relation, and the cumulative genetic narrowing across those generations was substantial. The specific consequence that history remembers most vividly arrived in 1904 with the birth of Tsarevich Alexei, the long-awaited male heir to the Russian throne. Alexei had hemophilia B, the blood-clotting disorder that Queen Victoria had quietly seeded into the royal houses of Europe through her own descendants, a genetic gift passed through carrier daughters who showed no symptoms themselves but transmitted the condition to roughly half their sons. For Alexei, a bruise could become a medical crisis. Internal bleeding from a minor injury could leave him screaming in pain for days. The boy's suffering was constant, unpredictable, and utterly beyond the reach of the medicine of his time, which created the opening for Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian peasant mystic who somehow, through methods still debated by historians, appeared to relieve Alexei's episodes when he visited. Alexandra became convinced Rasputin was divinely sent to protect her son. Nicholas, who found Rasputin deeply unsettling, deferred to his wife's certainty. And so, a wandering faith healer achieved an influence over the most powerful royal family in the world that shaped foreign policies, ministerial appointments, and ultimately the political decisions that accelerated the dynasty's collapse. It is not an exaggeration to say that a genetic disorder, passed down through generations of carefully managed royal intermarriage, helped bring down the Romanov Empire. The dynasty's inbreeding coefficient was lower than most others, that will appear later in this list, making this almost the gentle introduction, the warm-up act before the numbers get genuinely alarming. The House of Valois. The Valois kings of France ruled for over 2.5 centuries, and if you read their history in order from first to last, the overall arc is one of gradual biological unraveling that mirrors the dynasty's political decline with uncomfortable precision. The early Valois kings were vigorous, expansionist, and reasonably healthy by medieval standards. By the end, they were producing rulers who were erratic, physically frail, and in at least one case convinced of something that has no parallel in the medical history of any other royal house in Europe. Charles VI, who reigned from 1380 to 1422, suffered from what contemporaries described as recurring episodes of violent madness, and he once killed 4 of his own knights during a sudden breakdown before he could be restrained. And in his quieter periods, he reportedly suffered from what historians now call the glass delusion, a documented medieval psychiatric condition in which the sufferer becomes convinced their body is made of glass and will shatter if touched. Charles believed this with complete sincerity. He refused to let people near him. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent his glass body from breaking. He reigned for 42 years in this condition, with France governed around him by competing factions who used his incapacity as a political battleground. Whether this was the result of inbreeding specifically or some other underlying condition is impossible to say with certainty across 6 centuries. But the Valois pattern across generations, shortened lifespans, physical fragility, mental instability, is difficult to attribute entirely to environment or misfortune. Francis II, who briefly wore the crown as Mary Queen of Scots' young husband, died at 16 after a life of illness. Henry III displayed behavior so erratic that even his contemporary court, which was not easily shocked, found him alarming. The dynasty ended not with a conquest or a revolution, but simply with Henry III's assassination in 1589, after which there was no Valois left capable of inheriting. The line had run dry, worn out by its own narrowing genetics across 2.5 centuries of carefully arranged marriages within Europe's shrinking pool of eligible royals. The Hawaiian royal family. The Hawaiian case is different from every other dynasty on this list in one crucial way. The intermarriage was not a political strategy or a diplomatic convenience. It was theology. The Ali, the Hawaiian chiefly class, operated under a system called kapu, in which bloodline purity was a sacred and cosmological necessity. The mana, the spiritual power, of a chief was understood to be a literal, heritable substance that could be diluted or corrupted by union with someone of insufficient rank. And the highest possible concentration of mana was achieved through what the tradition called the Po union, a marriage between a full brother and sister of the highest chiefly rank, whose offspring would carry the most concentrated sacred power achievable. This was not considered scandalous within the system. It was considered the highest possible honor, the most sacred possible act of dynastic continuity. The Kamehameha dynasty, which unified the Hawaiian Islands under Kamehameha I beginning in 1795, practiced this tradition in a context already made genetically extreme by simple geography. The Hawaiian Islands are among the most isolated landmasses on Earth, sitting roughly 2,000 miles from the nearest continental shore, and the alii class that had developed over centuries on those islands was already a small population by the time Western contact began in 1778. What followed Western contact made the situation dramatically worse. Introduced diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, venereal disease, swept through a population with no prior immunity, reducing the Hawaiian Islands' total population from estimates of around 300,000 at contact to fewer than 60,000 by the mid-19th century, with some estimates going lower. The alii class, small to begin with, was decimated. The pool of people considered of sufficient sacred rank to marry into the royal line shrank toward nothing, and yet the kapu obligations remained. Kamehameha V, the last of his dynasty to rule, died in 1872 without an heir and without having married, reportedly because he could not find a match of appropriate rank who met every required condition. His sister, Princess Victoria Kamamalu, who might have continued the line, had died years earlier. The dynasty ended not through conquest or coup, but because its own sacred rules, designed to concentrate power, had compressed the gene pool past the point of continuation. The Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies arrived in Egypt as Macedonian Greeks, military successors of Alexander the Great, who took control of the kingdom after his death in 323 BC. And within a generation or two, they had adopted the most extreme elements of Egyptian royal tradition and turned them into standing policy. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not a human ruler elevated to divine status. The pharaoh was a god, a living embodiment of Horus, destined to become Osiris in death. Marrying outside the divine bloodline was not merely politically unwise, it was cosmologically incoherent. The Ptolemies embraced this logic with remarkable thoroughness. Ptolemy II, who reigned from 285 to 246 BC, married his full sister Arsinoe II. A move so unusual to their Greek subjects that it earned him the epithet Philadelphus, sibling lover, which the Egyptians meant as a mark of divine legitimacy, and the Greeks found shocking enough to comment on extensively. But Philadelphus was only the beginning. Across the dynasty's 3-century run, full brother-sister marriages became the consistent pattern rather than the exception, generation after generation, with the family tree folding back on itself so completely that by the later Ptolemaic period scholars estimate some individuals carried inbreeding coefficients approaching 0.25, a number equivalent to what you would expect from the child of a parent and half-sibling union. not from a single union, but from the accumulated compression of multiple consecutive generations of sibling marriage. Cleopatra VII, the famous last queen, was herself a product of this system and continued it, ruling alongside her brothers Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV in succession, though her relationship with those brothers involved rather more political murder than most dynasties considered standard family management. The dynasty ended in 30 BC when Octavian's forces defeated the combined armies of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, and Cleopatra chose suicide over the indignity of a Roman triumph. The late Ptolemies had shown increasingly erratic and violent behavior across the final generations of the dynasty. And while Rome's military superiority is the proximate cause of the end, the biological condition of the ruling family by that point was not adding stability. The ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Separate from the Ptolemies entirely, those were Greek newcomers adopting Egyptian tradition. The native Egyptian pharaonic dynasties had been practicing strategic royal intermarriage for over 1,000 years before Alexander was born, and the most documented case comes from the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom, which ruled from approximately 1550 to 1292 BC, and produced some of the most recognizable names in the ancient world. Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and a boy king named Tutankhamun, whose tomb, discovered intact by Howard Carter in 1922, remains the most famous archaeological find in history. In 2010, a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association reported the results of DNA analysis conducted on 11 royal mummies from this period, including Tutankhamun himself. The findings were extraordinary and disturbing in roughly equal measure. The analysis concluded that Tutankhamun's parents were most likely full siblings, a brother and sister of the royal line who had produced a child together in keeping with the divine bloodline tradition, just as the Egyptians had been doing for generations. The physical evidence from Tutankhamun's mummy supported the genetic conclusion in ways that were hard to argue with. He had a severe clubfoot that would have made normal walking impossible, bone necrosis in multiple foot bones, a cleft palate, and evidence of multiple simultaneous malaria infections at the time of his death, at approximately 19 years of age. More than 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb, not ceremonial objects but actual functional aids, worn from use. He was a pharaoh god who could barely walk. The theological reasoning behind all of this was as airtight as the Ptolemaic version. The pharaoh's blood was divine, a literal inheritance from the gods, and diluting it through marriage to a mortal of common lineage was not merely undesirable but religiously prohibited. The result, repeated across enough generations, was a divine bloodline that expressed its divinity most visibly through clubfoot and bone decay. The DNA study has been contested by some scientists who argue that ancient samples are vulnerable to contamination, and those objections are scientifically legitimate, but the physical deformities are documented in the mummy itself and require no genetic analysis to confirm. The Habsburg Dynasty. The Habsburgs are, by almost any measure, the most thoroughly documented case of dynastic inbreeding in European history. And the reason we know this with such precision is that in 2019, a team of researchers published a peer-reviewed study in the journal Scientific Reports, in which they analyzed the genealogical records of over 6,000 individuals across 16 generations of Habsburg ancestry, and calculated inbreeding coefficients for the dynasty's members with a level of mathematical rigor that had never previously been applied to a royal family at this scale. What they found confirmed what portrait painters had been quietly recording for 4 centuries. The Habsburgs were getting more inbred with every passing generation, and the physical consequences were accumulating in lockstep. The dynasty's founding philosophy was famously summarized in a Latin phrase attributed to Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, directed at the Habsburgs themselves. "Let others wage war. You happy Austria, marry." Marriage was the Habsburg instrument of empire. Through strategic intermarriage with the royal houses of Burgundy, Spain, Bohemia, and Hungary, the family had assembled by the 16th century the largest territorial empire in European history without fighting for most of it. The problem was that this same strategy, applied across enough generations, meant the family was constantly marrying its own cousins, and the cousins were marrying cousins who were already related from 2 directions, and the resulting genealogy compressed into something that mathematicians would describe as a graph with far too few nodes. The most visible consequence was physical, and it was painted into history in extraordinary detail: the Habsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism, an extreme forward projection of the lower jaw combined with a pronounced underbite, appears across centuries of Habsburg portraiture in a progression that tracks the family's inbreeding coefficient with remarkable fidelity. Separate 2019 study published in Annals of Human Biology analyzed 66 portraits of Habsburg rulers spanning 2 centuries and found a direct statistical correlation between a subject's calculated inbreeding coefficient and the severity of their jaw deformity. The jaw was severe enough in many members to interfere with chewing and speaking. It was also, for a time, considered a mark of noble identity, the visible brand of Habsburg blood, until the generations arrived in which it was no longer a mark of distinction but a sign of biological distress. The Spanish Habsburg branch. If the Austrian Habsburgs were the controlled experiment, the Spanish branch was what happened when you took the same genetic material and ran the same experiment faster and without stopping. When Charles I of Spain, simultaneously Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, divided his enormous empire between his son Philip II in Spain and his brother Ferdinand in Austria in the mid-16th century, he created 2 separate Habsburg dynasties that then continued to intermarry with each other for the next century and a half, creating a genetic feedback loop of almost geometric intensity. The Spanish Habsburgs married Austrians, the Austrians married Spanish, and then the children of those marriages married back into both lines, so that by the mid-17th century, a Spanish Habsburg king's family tree contained the same ancestors appearing from multiple directions simultaneously, not as a curiosity, but as a structural feature of every generation. Philip II of Spain, considered one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, married his own niece Anna of Austria as his 4th wife. His son Philip III married a relative. Philip IV married his niece Mariana of Austria. Each generation the coefficient tightened. Philip IV's inbreeding coefficient has been estimated at approximately 0.21, comparable to what you would expect from the offspring of a half-sibling union, and he was not the worst of the line. The infant mortality rate in the Spanish Habsburg line across the 17th century was staggering. Of the 34 children born to Spanish Habsburg parents in this period, 17 died before their first birthday, compared to a general European infant mortality rate for the same era of roughly 20%. The Spanish line was losing half its children before they could walk, in a dynasty that commanded the most powerful empire on earth. The jaw was worsening with each generation. The physical fragility was accelerating. And at the end of the line waited someone who would make every previous case in this video look moderate by comparison. Charles II of Spain. Charles II of Spain was the product of everything that came before him: the Austrian branch, the Spanish branch, the intermarriage of cousins who were already cousins, repeated and compounded across 9 generations of Habsburg family policy, and the numbers that result from that accumulation are genuinely difficult to process. According to the 2019 scientific report study, Charles II carried an inbreeding coefficient of approximately 0.254. For context, the expected coefficient for the child of a full brother-sister union is 0.25. Charles was not the product of a single incestuous pairing. He was the product of 9 generations of cousin marriages so consistently close that the cumulative result exceeded, in mathematical terms, what a single act of full sibling reproduction would have produced. His family tree, which should theoretically contain 128 distinct individuals across 7 generations, contained only 32. His ancestor Philip I of Castile appears in his genealogy 14 separate times. The family tree had not merely narrowed, it had collapsed into something that barely qualified as a tree at all. The physical consequences were severe, extensively documented by contemporary observers, and deeply sad in a way that the earlier Habsburg cases are not. Because Charles, by all accounts, was a gentle and kind person who understood to some degree that his body and mind were not working as they should. He could not chew solid food. His lower jaw protruded so far that his upper and lower teeth never made contact, and he drooled constantly because his tongue was described by contemporaries as too large for his mouth. He did not walk until he was 8 years old. He did not speak clearly until his teenage years. He was bald by 35 and suffered from chronic digestive problems, persistent diarrhea and vomiting throughout his adult life. He was also impotent, or at least produced no children across 2 marriages, to Marie-Louise of Orléans and later Mariana of Neuburg, both of whom desperately wanted to provide an heir and failed entirely. The court's response to this failure was not genetic analysis, that would wait 3 centuries, but exorcism. The Spanish court concluded that Charles must be bewitched, that no natural explanation could account for the condition of a Habsburg king, and Charles himself reportedly believed this and submitted to the exorcisms willingly. He died in 1700 at the age of 38, reportedly leaving behind an autopsy, documented by contemporaries, though historians debate its accuracy, that described a body in a state of extraordinary deterioration. His death without an heir triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that drew in France, England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and several smaller powers, and which reshaped the political map of Europe over 14 years of warfare. The marriage strategy of a single dynasty, pursued with complete consistency for 9 generations, had produced a king whose body could not function and whose death could not be managed without a continental war. Charles II was not a monster or a villain. He was a kind man who was handed, at birth, the accumulated biological consequences of 2 centuries of decisions made by people who believed they were doing the right thing for their bloodline. He was the end of the line, literally, mathematically, and in every other sense, and no amount of exorcism was going to change that.
Cleopatra VII. The Ptolemaic dynasty didn't just tolerate incest, they built a brand around it. For nearly 3 centuries, Egypt's Greek-speaking pharaohs treated sibling marriage not as a scandal, but as a divine mandate, pointing to Zeus and Hera as their celestial role models, and apparently deciding that if it worked for the gods, it would work for them. Cleopatra VII, born around 69 BC, was the product of this system, a family tree that had been folding back on itself since Ptolemy II married his full sister, Arsinoe II, around 279 BC, establishing the precedent that would define the dynasty. Ptolemy II even took the epithet Philadelphus, meaning sibling-loving, as though he wanted to make absolutely sure posterity understood his priorities. By the time Cleopatra arrived, the bloodline had been looping through cousin marriages and close relative unions for so many generations that untangling her precise ancestry is nearly impossible. Her mother's identity remains historically uncertain, which is a remarkable thing to say about the most famous queen in history. And yet, Cleopatra was brilliant. She spoke approximately 9 languages, according to the ancient historian Plutarch, was a gifted political strategist, and managed to align herself with the 2 most powerful men in the Roman world in sequence. She is the most functional person to ever emerge from a dynasty running on genetic fumes, which either says something extraordinary about her or something deeply unsettling about how much raw talent gets suppressed when your family has been marrying itself for 10 generations. She was the last of her line, and when she died in 30 BC, she took the Ptolemaic experiment in deliberate consanguinity with her, though the damage to the concept of healthy royal bloodlines had only just begun. Pharaoh Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun's tomb contained 130 walking sticks, and for a long time people assumed they were ceremonial. They were not. The boy who ruled Egypt from approximately 1332 to 1323 BC needed them because his body, the product of a full sibling union between his father Akhenaten and a woman DNA analysis identified as Akhenaten's own sister, was failing him from the moment he was born. The 2010 JAMA study that analyzed genetic material from 11 royal mummies confirmed what the physical evidence had been suggesting all along. Tutankhamun had a calculated inbreeding coefficient of approximately 0.25, which is the statistical equivalent of being the child of 2 full biological siblings. The physical consequences were extensive and documented. He had a cleft palate, a club foot, Kohler disease causing bone necrosis in his foot, and multiple additional skeletal abnormalities identified through CT scanning. He likely walked with a pronounced limp, leaning on those canes not as symbols of authority but as tools of basic mobility. He died at approximately 19 years old, probably from a combination of malaria, multiple strains of which were found in his mummified remains, and the cascading organ failures that come with a body built on a compromised genetic blueprint. Found in his tomb alongside him were 2 tiny mummified figures, his daughters, both stillborn or dead in infancy, their own bodies too fragile to sustain life. He is the most scientifically documented case of royal inbreeding in human history, not because his situation was unique, but because modern technology finally gave us the tools to look directly at what the ancient Egyptians had done and measure exactly how much it cost. Joanna of Castile. History called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, and then locked her in a castle for 46 years to make sure the story stuck. Joanna was born in 1479 to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, who were themselves distant cousins, and was then married to Philip I of Habsburg, who was her second cousin, meaning the genetic compression that would eventually produce Charles II was already underway before Joanna was old enough to understand what a dynasty was. Whether Joanna was genuinely mentally ill or a politically dangerous queen who was systematically portrayed as unstable by the men who wanted her power is one of history's more pointed open questions. What is documented is that after Philip's sudden death in 1506, her grief was extreme and public. She reportedly refused to leave his coffin, ordering it opened to verify he was still dead, which her contemporaries treated as evidence of madness rather than the behavior of a woman who had been told repeatedly that her judgment could not be trusted. Her father Ferdinand had her imprisoned. Her son Charles V kept her imprisoned. She remained confined in Tordesillas from roughly 1509 until her death in 1555, meaning she outlived her jailers and her usefulness as a political problem by decades, dying at 75 inches, a room she had occupied for nearly half a century. Her son, Charles V, would become the most powerful ruler in Europe. Her grandson, Philip II, would inherit a Spanish empire at its height, and the inbreeding coefficient that would eventually produce a king who couldn't chew his own food was ticking forward with every generation. Each marriage a little closer, each family tree a little more tangled, and nobody in the room willing to say it out loud. Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman the Magnificent ruled the Ottoman Empire from 1520 to 1566, at the absolute peak of its power. His armies reached the gates of Vienna, his navy controlled the Mediterranean, and his legal reforms earned him the title, the Lawgiver, in his own lands. He is not on this list because he was inbred. He is on this list because he was the last person standing before the Ottoman system of succession began delivering visibly broken results, and understanding why requires understanding the machinery that produced his heirs. The Ottomans had formalized fratricide as succession policy. When a new sultan took the throne, his brothers were executed, a practice codified under Mehmed II in the late 15th century. When fratricide became politically uncomfortable in the early 17th century, it was replaced with the caste system, in which princes were confined in isolated palace apartments from childhood, with no education, no governance experience, and no meaningful human contact beyond a handful of companions. The genetic pool feeding this system was also narrowing. Royal women and concubines were drawn from an increasingly restricted network, and the top of the Ottoman bloodline had been compressing for generations. The results would arrive within 2 reigns. Suleiman's son, Selim II, was known as Selim the Drunk. His great-great-grandson Mustafa, I would be so mentally incapacitated that he spent his sultanate wandering palace halls and throwing coins into the sea. Suleiman himself was the last point at which Ottoman dynastic genetics and Ottoman imperial power were both simultaneously at their height. After him, one of those lines went only downward. Henry VI of England. Henry VI of England inherited a kingdom and a catastrophe in the same bloodstream. His maternal grandfather was Charles VI of France, a king who believed, with complete sincerity, that he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him, a delusion so specific and so persistent that it has its own entry in the history of psychiatric literature. Charles VI's episodes began in 1392 and continued until his death in 1422, and the cognitive fragility that produced them did not stop at the border. Henry VI, born in 1421, began showing signs of severe mental breakdown by his early 30s, and in August of 1453, he entered a complete catatonic collapse that lasted approximately 16 months. During this time, he could not speak, could not move with purpose, and could not recognize his own newborn son, Edward of Westminster, who was born during the breakdown and presented to his father repeatedly without any response. The political vacuum this created was the direct ignition point of the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict that would consume England until 1485 and kill thousands. When Henry briefly recovered in late 1454, the damage was already irreversible. Rival factions had organized around his incapacity, and no amount of lucid intervals would put that back together. He was deposed in 1461, briefly restored in 1470, and almost certainly murdered in the Tower of London on or around the 21st of May, 1471. He is not a cautionary tale about weakness. He is a demonstration of what happens when a heritable psychiatric condition reaches the top of a monarchy during a moment of political instability, and the answer, consistently, is war. Mustafa, the first of the Ottoman Empire. Mustafa I survived the Ottoman succession process because he was considered too mentally impaired to be a threat, which is both the saddest and most clarifying sentence in this entire video. He was kept in the kafes, the palace confinement system for Ottoman princes, from a young age, in isolation that would have been psychologically devastating to anyone, let alone someone whose mental health was already compromised before the confinement began. When his nephew Ahmed I died in 1617, Mustafa emerged from the cafes and onto the throne, And what the court got was a sultan who reportedly wandered the palace, releasing palace staff from their duties for no reason, threw coins into the sea from palace windows, and was observed in states of apparent confusion and distress by court observers whose accounts survive in Ottoman chronicles. He was deposed after approximately 3 months. His nephew, Osman II, took the throne, then was assassinated in 1622 during a Janissary revolt, and Mustafa was reinstated not because anyone thought he was capable of ruling, but because the alternatives were worse. He lasted another year before being deposed again. He died in 1639, having technically been sultan twice, without having governed anything in any meaningful sense, the product of a dynastic system that had spent a century and a half eliminating its most capable potential heirs through fratricide and confinement while simultaneously narrowing its genetic pool. He was not a failure. He was an outcome. The system that produced him had been running the calculation for generations, and Mustafa I was simply what the math produced when it finally came due. Charles II of Spain. Charles II of Spain had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, which is higher than the expected coefficient of a child born to 2 full biological siblings, and that number alone should communicate everything about what the Habsburg dynasty had done to itself over 2 centuries of strategic, consanguineous marriage. A 2009 study published in PLOS One, authored by Alvarez, Ceballos, and Quintero, calculated this figure and identified the most likely medical consequences: combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis, both recessive conditions that only express themselves when defective copies are inherited from both parents simultaneously, which becomes nearly statistically inevitable when both parents are, genetically speaking, nearly the same person. His jaw protruded so severely from the characteristic Habsburg mandibular prognathism that he could not properly chew his food. His tongue was reportedly large enough to impede his speech. He could not walk until he was 8 years old. He was incontinent, prone to seizures, described by contemporaries as mentally limited, and in his final years became so consumed by superstition and religious ritual that an exorcism was reportedly performed at his request, because he had become convinced he was cursed. He was, in a way, just not supernaturally. He was married twice, to Marie-Louise of Orléans and then to Maria Anna of Neuburg, and produced no surviving children from either marriage. When he died on the 1st of November 1700, at age 38, his autopsy reportedly described a body in a state of extraordinary deterioration. Accounts mention shrunken organs, a single, undescended testicle, and systemic fluid accumulation, though the precise reliability of those accounts varies. His death without an heir triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped the borders and balance of power across Europe. He didn't bring down the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburg dynasty built him, one carefully arranged marriage at a time, and then watched him collapse under the weight of what they'd constructed. The 18th dynasty inbreeding cluster. Tutankhamun didn't arrive in a vacuum. He was the endpoint of at least 3 to 4 consecutive generations of deliberate, close relative marriage within ancient Egypt's 18th dynasty, a sustained compression of bloodlines that makes him not an aberration, but a logical conclusion. His grandfather, Amenhotep III, who ruled from approximately 1388 to 1351 BC, is recorded in temple inscriptions as having married his own daughter, Sidamun, elevating her to the title of Great Royal Wife, a role that carried both ceremonial and dynastic significance. Whether this was consummated in the biological sense, or was primarily a ritual consolidation of royal power, remains debated among Egyptologists. But the inscriptional evidence of the marriage itself is not disputed. Amenhotep III's son, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, then continued the pattern, producing Tutankhamun with his own sister, according to the 2010 JAMA DNA study. The dynasty that followed from Amenhotep III, through Akhenaten, through Tutankhamun, represents one of the most sustained and archaeologically documented experiments in deliberate royal inbreeding in any ancient civilization, carried out not accidentally, but as a feature of how divine kingship was understood to function. The result was a boy king with a clubfoot and a handful of malarial infections who died at 19, leaving 2 stillborn daughters in his tomb and no living male heir behind him. Power passed eventually to the military general Horemheb, who was not of royal blood, and the 18th dynasty effectively ended there not with a conquest or a revolution, but with a bloodline that had compressed itself into silence.
Ferdinand I of Austria. Ferdinand I became Emperor of Austria in 1835 and almost immediately demonstrated that the Habsburg dynasty had learned nothing from the previous 2 centuries of producing compromised heirs. His parents were first cousins twice over, meaning both sets of grandparents were also first cousins, making him the product of a double first cousin marriage, a level of genetic overlap that would be considered extraordinary outside the specific context of 19th century European royalty, where it was apparently considered a reasonable dynastic strategy. Ferdinand was epileptic, that much is historically documented, and his cognitive limitations were severe enough that Prince Metternich, one of the most strategically sophisticated diplomats in European history, essentially administered the Austrian Empire in his name for the better part of a decade. The empire ran. Ferdinand signed documents and attended ceremonies, and reportedly, according to widely cited but source-uncertain accounts, once stated that he was the emperor and wanted dumplings, a quote that may be apocryphal but has survived precisely because it sounds exactly right. He ruled until 1848, when the revolutions sweeping Europe gave the Habsburg court a convenient reason to replace him with his nephew Franz Joseph I, and he abdicated on December 2 of that year. Then he retired to Prague and lived until 1875, reaching the age of 82 longer than almost any Habsburg of the preceding generation, which is either a medical miracle or a reminder that longevity and fitness for leadership are entirely different biological questions. Eric XIV of Sweden. Eric XIV of Sweden was, by most accounts, genuinely brilliant, educated, intellectually curious, fluent in multiple languages, and possessed of real political instincts right up until the evening in May of 1567, when he ordered the imprisonment of the Sture family, one of Sweden's most powerful noble houses, and then personally participated in their killing in what can only be described as a psychotic episode of the First Order. Members of the Sture family were killed in Uppsala Castle. Eric, by contemporary accounts, was in a dissociated state during the violence and afterward wandered into the Swedish countryside dressed in peasant clothing, apparently believing himself to no longer be the king. When he returned to lucidity, he reportedly wept over what had happened and attempted to pay blood money to the surviving Sture family members, which did not go as well as he might have hoped. The Vasa dynasty, which Eric's father Gustav I had founded in 1523, carried a pattern of psychological instability across multiple members. Historians have used the term Vasa madness to describe the heritable psychiatric legacy that appeared in Eric in elements of his brother Johann III's behavior and in other members of the line. Eric's inbreeding coefficient was not extreme by Habsburg standards, but the concentrated expression of mental illness across the dynasty suggests heritable psychiatric vulnerability amplified by a narrow gene pool. He was deposed by his brother Johann in 1568, imprisoned, and died on the 26th of February 1577. Almost certainly poisoned analysis of his remains, conducted in the 20th century, found arsenic concentrations consistent with deliberate poisoning. The pea soup his guards reportedly served him in his final days has become one of history's more grimly specific details. The Aves Trastamara Iberian cluster. The inbreeding that ultimately produced Charles II of Spain didn't begin with the Habsburgs. It began a century and a half earlier, in the interlocking royal houses of Portugal and Castile, where the House of Aves and the House of Trastamara spent decades exchanging children in marriage until their bloodlines were nearly indistinguishable. Joanna of Portugal, born in 1439, married Henry IV of Castile in 1455, a union that required papal dispensation because of their blood relationship. Henry was her uncle or close relative by consanguinity, depending on which line of the genealogy you trace. The daughter produced by this marriage, known as La Beltraneja, became the center of a succession crisis so severe it escalated into the War of Castilian Succession from 1475 to 1479. With her legitimacy disputed on both political and implicitly biological grounds, Henry IV himself is described by chroniclers of the era as possibly impotent or infertile, with his ability to father children questioned publicly in a way that would have been unthinkable for a less compromised king. This generation, messy, contested, medically ambiguous, directly produced the circumstances under which Ferdinand and Isabella came to power, married in 1469 as themselves distant cousins, and then handed the entire accumulated genetic burden of 2 inbreeding Iberian dynasties to the Habsburg line when their daughter Joanna married Philip of Habsburg. The explosion Charles II, empty throne, continental war, took another 150 years to detonate, but the fuse was lit in 15th century Iberia. In a series of carefully negotiated royal marriages,
that everyone at the time considered good politics. Charles II of Spain, The Reckoning. Coming back to Charles II is not repetition, it is the only honest way to end this. Because every person on this list, from Cleopatra's looping Ptolemaic pedigree to Tutankhamun's shattered bones to Ferdinand I sitting blankly on the Habsburg throne while Metternich ran his empire, was part of the same long, slow calculation that terminated, definitively, in a single human being born in Madrid on the 6th of November, 1661. The 2009 PLOS One study by Alvarez, Ceballos, and Quintero titled The Role of Inbreeding in the Extinction of a European Royal Dynasty is among the most precise scientific autopsies ever performed on a historical bloodline. It found that Charles II's specific diseases, combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis, were the direct result of recessive gene mutations expressing simultaneously because both copies of the relevant genes, inherited from both parents, were defective, a statistical near impossibility in a normally reproducing population, and a near certainty in his. His ancestor Joanna of Castile appears in his genealogy repeatedly, her genetic contribution looping back through the tree from multiple directions like a river that keeps finding the same valley. He could not properly walk, he could not properly speak, he could not produce an heir from two separate marriages. He was exorcised, by his own request, because the gap between what a king was supposed to be and what he actually was had become so vast that supernatural explanation felt more manageable than the biological one. When he died in 1700, his autopsy recorded by the royal physicians who examined him described a body of a 38-year-old man that read like something decades older. Organs diminished, systems failed, the architecture of a human life built on a foundation that had been structurally compromised from the first moment of his existence. He did not fail. He was failed by 200 years of dynastic decision-making that treated human beings as variables in a political equation and never once stopped to ask what the equation was actually solving for.
The Fugates of Kentucky. Martin Fugate arrived in eastern Kentucky around 1820 as a French orphan with almost nothing to his name, settling near a remote stretch of water called Troublesome Creek in the Appalachian Mountains. He married a local woman named Elizabeth Smith, and by all accounts it seemed like an ordinary frontier marriage, except for one invisible detail that neither of them could have known. Both Martin and Elizabeth carried a rare recessive gene variant responsible for a condition called methemoglobinemia, a disorder in which hemoglobin molecules lose their ability to carry oxygen efficiently, causing the blood to run dark and the skin to take on a visibly blue or purple-gray tone. Carrying one copy of the gene produces no outward effect whatsoever. Carrying two copies turns you the color of a fresh bruise from the moment you're born. For that to happen to a child, both parents need to be carriers, a statistical rarity under normal circumstances. But Troublesome Creek was not normal circumstances. The mountains of eastern Kentucky in the early 19th century were some of the most geographically isolated terrain in North America, with no roads, no bridges, and no real reason for outsiders to come in or for locals to leave. The Fugates married their neighbors, and their neighbors were their cousins, and their cousins were their neighbors' cousins. And over the following century, the same small pool of bloodlines circulated through the same small set of hollows and creek beds in an endless loop. The recessive gene, instead of being diluted and eventually disappearing as it would in a larger outbreeding population, got concentrated. Blue children started appearing in almost every generation. Some families had multiple blue children. The community largely accepted this as simply a Fugate family trait. Strange, certainly, but not life-threatening, since methemoglobinemia in this form, while visually dramatic, didn't typically cause severe health consequences beyond fatigue and occasional shortness of breath. The family lived, worked, farmed, and died in those mountains for generation after generation, and the blue skin became as unremarkable to the neighbors as the color of the creek itself. It wasn't until the 1960s that a hematologist named Dr. Madison Cowing, working out of the University of Kentucky, heard rumors of blue-skinned people living in the hills and drove out to find them. He did. He drew blood, confirmed the methemoglobinemia diagnosis, and treated several family members with intravenous injections of methylene blue, a compound that temporarily restores hemoglobin's oxygen-carrying function, and watched their skin turn pink within minutes for the first time in their lives. The most famous modern case is Benjamin Stacy, born in 1975, who came into the world so visibly blue that the hospital staff panicked before his grandmother calmly explained the family history. Benji's blue color faded as he grew older, which is typical when a person carries only one copy of the gene rather than two. Today, the Fugate case is a standard teaching example in genetics courses worldwide, used to demonstrate exactly how a rare recessive trait survives and spreads in a population that never stops marrying itself. The Whitakers of West Virginia. The Whitakers live in Odd, West Virginia. And yes, that is a real place name, and yes, it fits perfectly. Filmmaker Mark Laita first visited the property in 2004 while working on a photography project documenting extreme poverty in rural America, and was immediately chased off by a family member with a shotgun. He came back years later, built a cautious rapport through repeated visits and small acts of assistance, and in 2020 released footage of the family that spread across the internet with the speed of something people genuinely couldn't believe was real. The video accumulated tens of millions of views in a matter of weeks. The Whitakers are not a historical case. They are alive right now, on that property in Odd, West Virginia, and they represent what the accumulated biological consequences of multi-generational close relative reproduction look like when you remove every external corrective force. Education, healthcare, legal oversight, economic mobility, and simply let a family fold in on itself for decades. Several family members are entirely nonverbal. Others communicate in ways that are very difficult to understand. Multiple individuals display physical features and behavioral patterns consistent with what geneticists call inbreeding depression, the process by which repeated reproduction between closely related individuals causes harmful recessive gene variants to stack up across generations until they begin expressing themselves as visible physical and cognitive impairments. The precise degree of familial relationship between the various Whitaker family members has never been publicly confirmed through genetic testing, but the visible evidence and local community accounts strongly suggest multiple consecutive generations of close relative reproduction within a bloodline that never substantially introduced outside genetic material. West Virginia has historically had some of the highest rates of rural poverty, geographic isolation, and limited state social service reach in the entire United States. And the combination of those factors with a family already living on the margins created conditions where this degree of generational inbreeding could persist for decades without triggering any formal intervention. Laita has continued visiting. In a 2023 follow-up video, he documented modest improvements in the family's living conditions. New flooring, a cleaner home, funded in part by donations that came in after the original video went viral. He has consistently presented the family with more dignity than most observers expected, resisting the obvious temptation to frame them as spectacle. But the underlying genetic reality documented in those videos doesn't change with a coat of paint. The Whitakers are the most visible contemporary example in the United States of what happens at the biological endpoint of extreme generational inbreeding. Not in a history book, not in a medieval dynasty, but in a house you could drive to right now. The Lykov family. In 1936, a Soviet officer shot and killed a man named Lykov in front of his brother Karp. Karp Lykov was a devout old believer, a member of a Russian Orthodox sect that had been persecuted by both the Tsarist and Soviet governments for centuries. And in the aftermath of his brother's murder, with Stalinist anti-religious purges intensifying across the Soviet Union, he made a decision that would define the rest of his family's existence. He took his wife Akolina, their son Savin, and their daughter Natalia, and walked into the Siberian taiga. They kept walking until there was nothing around them but forest. They settled eventually in the Abakan range of the western Sayan Mountains, at an elevation of over 1,000 meters. More than 250 kilometers from the nearest human settlement. In isolation, Akolina gave birth to two more children, Dmitry and Agafia, who were born knowing nothing of the outside world, no other humans, no other voices, no other reference point for reality beyond their immediate family of 6, and the wilderness pressing in on every side. The family survived for 42 years this way, growing rye and potatoes in a small clearing, hunting with handmade tools, and praying according to old believer traditions using handwritten religious texts they had carried into the forest. They lost Akolina to starvation in 1961, during a particularly brutal winter when the crops failed. The children grew up, but there was nowhere for them to go, and no one outside the family for them to form relationships with. The genetic implications of that reality require no elaboration. Then in 1978, a team of Soviet geologists conducting an aerial survey spotted the clearing and landed. The Lykovs' first contact with another human being in over 4 decades was a group of scientists who materialized from the taiga carrying equipment the family had never seen. 3 of the 4 Lykov children died in 1981, within months of each other, shortly after that contact began. The most widely accepted explanation is immune naivety. Decades of total isolation had left them with no acquired immunity to pathogens that are entirely routine for anyone with normal social exposure, and the geologists, without knowing it, had simply breathed in their direction. Agafia Lykov, the youngest, survived. As of the early 2020s, she is still alive, still living alone in the taiga, near the original family settlement, now in her late 70s, having outlasted every other member of her family, and continued refusing permanent settlement despite the Soviet government's and later the Russian government's periodic offers. She receives occasional visitors and supply drops. She remains, in practical terms, the last living member of a family that compressed an entire gene pool down to the size of a single household and then sealed it shut for half a century. The Habsburgs and their surviving descendants. The Habsburg dynasty ruled over the better part of Europe for roughly 3 centuries, and they did it partly through war and partly through marriage, specifically, marriage to each other. The logic was straightforward from a political standpoint. If you marry your daughter to a foreign king, you create an alliance. If you marry your daughter to your nephew, you keep the territory, the titles, and the inheritance all within the family. Uncles married nieces. First cousins married repeatedly across generations. The same family names cycled through the dynasty's genealogical records in loops that would be illegal under the laws of virtually every modern country. For a while, it worked. The Habsburgs accumulated control over Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and vast colonial territories across the Americas. But the genetic bill was accumulating the entire time, and it eventually came due in the form of Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, the last Habsburg king of the Spanish branch, and quite possibly the most medically documented victim of deliberate dynastic inbreeding in recorded history. A 2019 study published in the journal Heredity reconstructed the Habsburg pedigree across 16 generations and more than 6,000 individuals to calculate Charles II inbreeding coefficient, the statistical measure of how likely he was to have inherited identical gene copies from a common ancestor, and arrived at a figure of 0.254. For context, the inbreeding coefficient that would result from a child born to 2 full siblings is 0.5. Charles II exceeded that. His jaw protruded so severely, the characteristic Habsburg mandibular prognathism that appears in painted portraits getting more extreme with each successive generation, that he reportedly could not chew solid food. He didn't speak until he was 4 years old. He never walked steadily. He suffered what court physicians described as recurring convulsions, and was mentally impaired in ways that made governing largely a ceremonial exercise. He was married twice and produced no surviving children, ending the Spanish Habsburg line entirely and triggering the War of the Spanish Succession. The broader dynasty's infant mortality rate during the height of its inbreeding practices exceeded 50%, more than double the roughly 20% rate in the general Spanish population of the same era, itself already devastated by the standards of modern medicine. Epilepsy, immune dysfunction, and what historical records describe as melancholy and madness, appeared with disproportionate frequency across the family tree. The Austrian branch lasted longer and was somewhat more genetically cautious in its later centuries, which is why its descendants exist today. The House of Habsburg-Lorraine includes living members, among them Karl von Habsburg, born in 1961, and his children, modern individuals who marry outside the family and live unremarkable contemporary lives, but who carry in their DNA the genetic legacy of 500 years of a family that treated marriage as a territorial strategy and paid for it in bone deformity, infant mortality, and the slow extinction of an entire royal line. The Colt family. In 2012, in a dry paddock near the town of Burrawa in rural New South Wales, Australian welfare authorities encountered a scene that initially defied their ability to process it. 12 people were found living in conditions of extreme squalor on a remote property. The children had no birth certificates, had never attended school, and communicated in what investigators initially couldn't identify as any recognizable language. It was later determined to be a severely degraded form of English combined with invented vocabulary, a dialect that had evolved in complete isolation from any outside linguistic input. Medical examinations of the children found fused vertebrae, intellectual disabilities, severe developmental delays, and physical deformities consistent with multi-generational inbreeding. One adult male family member was assessed with an IQ below 40. The family, referred to in all Australian court proceedings and media coverage by the pseudonym the Colts, To protect the identities of the children involved, had a family structure in which the children of the founding couple, referred to in court records as Charlie and Betty Colt, had reproduced with each other, producing a third generation of children born from sibling relationships. In some instances, the degree of biological relationship between the parents of specific children could not be definitively established because the family's own accounts were contradictory and unreliable, and there were no external records of any kind to cross-reference. Criminal proceedings stretched across several years of New South Wales court hearings, resulting in multiple convictions for incest and child sexual abuse. The case prompted a significant review of child protection policies in rural New South Wales, particularly regarding the state's capacity to identify and intervene with families living entirely off-grid and outside any institutional contact. The children removed from the property faced a challenge that is almost impossible to fully articulate. They were being asked to integrate into a society for which they had no framework whatsoever. They had never used a telephone. They had never watched television. They had never interacted with a human being outside their own family unit. Several older children functioned cognitively at the level of toddlers. The Colt case is not from a distant century or a geographically inaccessible corner of the developing world. It unfolded in Australia in the 2010s, in a country with compulsory education laws, a universal healthcare system, and a functioning child protection bureaucracy, which makes it perhaps the most disturbing demonstration on this entire list of how thoroughly a family can disappear from every social system designed to catch exactly this kind of situation, and what the biological consequences look like when it does. The Sentinelese of North Sentinel Island. North Sentinel Island sits in the Bay of Bengal, part of the Andaman Islands chain administered by India, and from the air it looks like a green jewel ringed by turquoise water and coral reef. Roughly 72 square kilometers of dense jungle with no visible roads, no clearings, no structures that can be identified from above, and no sign of the people who live there except, occasionally, the figures of those people on the beach, drawing bows at the aircraft overhead. The Sentinelese have lived on that island for an estimated 50 to 60,000 years. They have resisted every attempt at contact, sometimes with arrows, sometimes with spears, always with unmistakable clarity, and as a result they remain one of the last genuinely uncontacted peoples on Earth, which means that almost everything known about their genetic situation is inferred rather than directly measured. What can be inferred is significant. A founding population that has been sealed from all outside genetic contact for 60 millennia, living on an island of 72 square kilometers with an estimated current population somewhere between 50 and 500 individuals. The range is that wide because no one has ever been able to count them safely, represents a genetic bottleneck of extraordinary depth. Every person on that island is descended from the same small group of ancestors. Every person on that island is, by definition, the relative of every other person on that island. The effective breeding population across their entire history has likely never exceeded a few hundred individuals at most, which means the Sentinelese gene pool contains a fraction of the diversity present in populations that have been mixing with outside groups throughout their existence. The biological consequences of that kind of long-term isolation in comparably sized founder populations typically include dramatically reduced overall genetic diversity, a higher prevalence of fixed recessive traits, and, most dangerously, severely compromised immune response to novel pathogens. That last point is exactly why the Indian government maintains a legal exclusion zone prohibiting approach within 3 nautical miles of the island. Contact with the outside world could expose the Sentinelese to diseases to which they have no immunity whatsoever, potentially with catastrophic results. In 2018, an American missionary named John Allen Chow paid local fishermen to bring him to the island in defiance of Indian law, with the stated intention of converting the Sentinelese to Christianity. He was killed by arrows on the beach. His death briefly refocused global attention on the island and prompted a debate that has never been fully resolved. Whether the Indian government's policy of protective isolation is itself a form of harm, denying a living population access to medicine, education, and genetic diversity in the name of cultural preservation, or whether forced contact would simply destroy them faster. The Sentinelese are the only entry on this list where the word inbreeding feels genuinely inadequate. This is not a family that made destructive choices, not a dynasty that prioritized power over biology, not a community trapped by geography and poverty. This is an entire people living inside the longest-running genetic bottleneck in human history, and the arrows on the beach are the only data they have ever chosen to share with the outside world. The Flemish noble child. Sometime around 1505, a painter working in the Flemish tradition captured the face of a child who would go unnamed in the historical record for nearly 5 centuries. The painting itself is a fairly unremarkable example of early 16th century aristocratic devotional art. Formal composition, rich fabrics, the careful stillness that wealthy patrons demanded from their portraits. What makes it remarkable is what a medical historian noticed about that face in 1965. The child depicted shows a constellation of physical features that modern clinicians recognize immediately. Almond-shaped eyes with epicanthal folds at their inner corners, a flattened nasal bridge, a small and rounded face, low-set ears, and a slightly open mouth with a protruding tongue. Taken individually, any one of these features could be explained away as artistic convention or individual variation. Taken together, they form a portrait that endocrinologist Lionel Penrose and his contemporaries argued represents the earliest known visual record of what we now call Down syndrome in a European noble context. Down syndrome itself is caused by the presence of a third copy of chromosome 21, a chromosomal event called trisomy 21, which occurs during cell division and results in a distinctive set of physical characteristics and developmental patterns that have existed in human populations throughout recorded history and long before it. The child in this painting lived that history. We do not know their name. We do not know whether they were the son or daughter of a merchant aristocrat, a minor duke, or a family with connections to one of the great Flemish courts. What we know is that someone considered this child worth painting, worth preserving in expensive pigment and formal composition, worth the hours of sitting and the considerable cost of commissioning a professional artist. That alone places this anonymous child in a small and privileged category. Most people born with Down syndrome in 15th and 16th century Europe left no trace in the historical record whatsoever. They died young, often within the first years of life, in an era when even children, without additional health vulnerabilities, faced brutal mortality rates. The ones who survived longer were frequently described in church and court records using the language of the era: innocent, simple, touched, terms that carried no cruelty in their original context, but that mapped onto a broad category of intellectual and developmental difference that we can only partially decode from this distance. This child was painted. That is the entirety of what history preserved. And yet that painting, that single act of artistic documentation, raises a question that haunts the rest of this history. How many royal and noble children with Down syndrome simply never made it into the record at all? Francisco Lezcano, El Niño de Vallecas. Of all the historical figures examined in this video, Francisco Lezcano has the clearest visual record, and that record was made by one of the greatest painters in human history. Diego Velázquez painted Lezcano sometime between 1637 and 1645 as part of a remarkable series of portraits of the court dwarfs employed by Philip IV of Spain. The Spanish royal court of the 17th century maintained a tradition of employing dwarfs, jesters, and what contemporaries called fools as companions and entertainers, a practice common across European courts but taken to unusual heights by the Habsburgs. These individuals were salaried members of the royal household, their names recorded in official payroll documents, their deaths noted in court records. Francisco Lezcano, known as El Niño de Vallecas, the boy from Vallecas, a town near Madrid, was among the most prominently documented. What sets Velázquez's portraits of these court figures apart from virtually every other aristocratic painting of the era is their ruthless visual honesty. Where other royal portraits idealized, smoothed, and elevated their subjects, Velázquez painted what he actually saw. He painted the specific shape of each face, the precise set of each pair of eyes, the exact posture of each body at rest. This is why his portraits of court dwarfs have become some of the most studied images in the history of medicine and disability, because Velázquez's commitment to realistic portraiture accidentally created documents of extraordinary diagnostic value. Medical historians and geneticists who have analyzed the painting of Lezcano identify a set of features entirely consistent with Down syndrome: the epicanthal folds, the flat nasal bridge, the rounded face, the short neck, and crucially, the posture, a characteristic relaxation in the limbs and torso that clinicians associate with the hypotonia or low muscle tone that affects the majority of people with trisomy 21. In the portrait, Lezcano sits, holding playing cards, looking directly out at the viewer with an expression that art historians have described variously as gentle, present, and quietly dignified. Velázquez did not paint him as a curiosity or a spectacle. He painted him as a person. Lezcano's life within the royal household was formalized and documented in the way that only royal employment could ensure. He received a salary. His existence was recorded. He was part of the machinery of the Spanish court in a way that gave him a historical visibility that virtually no other person with Down syndrome from this era possesses.
Philip IV's reign lasted from 1621 to 1665, encompassing one of the most turbulent periods in Spanish imperial history: wars, financial crises, territorial losses across Europe. And yet, within the elaborate social world of the Alcázar Palace in Madrid, Francisco Lezcano sat for one of the world's great painters and was preserved in pigment with a care and dignity that most kings of lesser kingdoms never received. The painting now hangs in the Museo del Prado in Madrid, where it has been for generations. His diagnosis remains retrospective and cannot be confirmed with the certainty of a modern clinical assessment. But among all the historical cases examined by researchers working at the intersection of art history and medical history, Lezcano's portrait is consistently cited as one of the most visually compelling pieces of evidence for Down syndrome in pre-modern Europe. The Habsburg inheritance. No royal family in European history has been studied more extensively for its genetic legacy than the Habsburgs. And for good reason. Over roughly 2 centuries of systematic intermarriage, uncles, wedding, nieces, cousins, marrying cousins across generation after generation, the Habsburg dynasty produced what geneticists analyzing their portraits and genealogical records in a 2019 study calculated to be one of the highest inbreeding coefficients ever documented in a human population. The most famous consequence of this was the progressive worsening of mandibular prognathism across the dynasty, the so-called Habsburg jaw, an extreme underbite that became so severe in Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king of Spain, who reigned from 1665 to 1700, that he reportedly could not chew his own food, could barely speak intelligibly, and was described by his own physicians in terms that suggest multiple overlapping genetic disorders. His autopsy, conducted after his death in 1700, noted that his body contained not a drop of blood, that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, and that his single testicle was as black as charcoal, a document of genetic catastrophe, so thorough it reads less like a medical report, and then a cautionary tale about dynastic inbreeding written in flesh. What is important to clarify here, because it is frequently misunderstood, is that Down syndrome is not caused by inbreeding. Trisomy 21 results from a random error during chromosomal division, a process called non-disjunction, in which chromosome 21 fails to separate properly, resulting in a cell with 3 copies instead of 2. This can happen in any family, in any population, and its rate is influenced by factors including maternal age, but not by consanguinity. What the Habsburg case illustrates instead is the broader truth about royal courts and developmental disability. Extreme genetic isolation produced a range of physical and cognitive conditions among Habsburg children and adults, and the court machinery that surrounded them was designed to manage, conceal, and ultimately erase the evidence of these conditions from official history. Several short-lived Habsburg infants and children, described in surviving correspondence as having intellectual disabilities or unusual physical features, have been assessed retrospectively by historians. None has been definitively identified as having Down syndrome specifically, but the pattern children born with atypical development, quietly managed by court physicians, absent from official portraiture, dying young, and leaving minimal documentary traces, is consistent across the dynasty and across European royal courts more broadly. The Habsburgs are not in this history because they are confirmed Down syndrome cases. They are in this history because they are the clearest example of how royal courts systematically process developmental difference, and because understanding that system is essential for understanding why the historical record of royal Down syndrome is so fragmentary. Prince John of Great Britain. Prince John was the 6th and youngest child of King George V and Queen Mary, born on July 12, 1905, into the most scrutinized royal family in the world. He was diagnosed with epilepsy that much is confirmed in royal records and family correspondence. Whether he also had Down syndrome or another developmental condition alongside his epilepsy remains a subject of historical debate, with some sources citing Down syndrome and others attributing his developmental differences solely to epilepsy and its neurological effects. What is not debated is what happened to him. From approximately 1916, when John was 11 years old, he was removed from the public life of the royal family almost entirely. He was relocated to Wood Farm, a cottage on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, where he lived under the dedicated care of his nurse, Charlotte Bill, known to the family as Lala, who became his primary companion and, by most historical accounts, the person who loved him most consistently. His parents visited. The visits were not frequent. His siblings were photographed with him occasionally in early family portraits, and then he simply disappeared from the visual record of the House of Windsor. Queen Mary's letters, portions of which were later published, describe John in terms that historians have characterized as emotionally distanced, reflecting both the Edwardian aristocratic norm of parental restraint and, possibly,
something more specific to a family that was acutely conscious of its public image. At a moment when the British monarchy was under extraordinary pressure, World War I, the Russian Revolution, the fall of cousin dynasties across Europe, John died on January 18, 1919, following a severe epileptic seizure. He was 13 years old. The official announcement was brief, to the point of bluntness. He was buried at Sandringham. His death received a fraction of the coverage that even minor royal events received in the press of the era. George V's diary entry for the day noted the death of his son and described it, in a phrase that has haunted historians ever since, as the greatest mercy. The average life expectancy for a child with Down syndrome in 1905 was somewhere between 9 and 12 years, limited primarily by the cardiac defects that affect roughly half of all people with trisomy 21, and for which no surgical intervention existed until the mid-20th century. Whether or not John had Down syndrome specifically, his story is the clearest documented example in British royal history of the system by which a child who did not fit the expected image of royal health and capacity was quietly removed from view and allowed to disappear from the record. The 2003 BBC film, The Lost Prince, brought his story to a wide modern audience for the first time, and the response, the genuine shock that a British prince had lived this way and died this young, illustrated how thoroughly the concealment had worked. The concept of the wholly innocent. Before the modern era, before John Langdon Down described trisomy 21 as a clinical condition in 1866, before chromosomes were understood, before genetics existed as a discipline, European courts and cultures had a framework for understanding people with Down syndrome, and that framework was theological. The term wholly innocent referred to people whose intellectual simplicity was interpreted not as a medical condition, but as a form of spiritual purity. Drawing on the biblical tradition of Matthew 18, verse 3, "Unless you become like little children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." Medieval and early modern Christian thought developed a theology of intellectual disability, in which people who could not reason in the conventional sense were understood to be, in some way, closer to God. They could not sin through complex deliberation. They could not scheme or deceive or accumulate the sophisticated moral failures that normal adult cognition made possible. They were innocent in a way that other people were not. This theological category shaped how royal courts documented, treated, and described children and adults who today would be diagnosed with Down syndrome or other intellectual disabilities. Court records across medieval and early modern Europe use the term innocent repeatedly for individuals who seem, from their physical and behavioral descriptions, to have had developmental conditions. This is not merely a historical curiosity. It is the reason that retrospective diagnosis of Down syndrome in royal contexts is so difficult. The documentation that survives does not describe symptoms in anything resembling clinical terms. It describes spiritual status. A child called simple and innocent in a 15th century court record might have had Down syndrome, or autism, or a traumatic brain injury, or might simply have been a slow learner by the standards of his tutors. The language collapses all of these possibilities into a single theological category and offers no further detail. What the wholly innocent framework did provide, in some cases, was a degree of protection. A child understood to be spiritually pure was, in at least some European traditions, considered to be under divine protection, dangerous to harm or neglect. Royal households that might otherwise have found a developmentally disabled child inconvenient could frame their care for that child as an act of piety. How often this translated into genuine care versus how often it was simply rhetorical cover for institutional neglect is impossible to determine from the surviving record. But the framework existed. It was widely understood, and it shaped every aspect of how European royal courts encountered Down syndrome for nearly 1,000 years before anyone had a name for the condition. The science of retrospective diagnosis. Forensic anthropologists working with skeletal remains from medieval royal tombs across Europe have, over the past 3 decades, developed increasingly sophisticated methods for identifying chromosomal conditions from physical remains. Down syndrome leaves markers in bone. The skull in trisomy 21 tends toward brachycephaly, a rounder, broader shape than the population average. The limb bones show characteristic proportions. The pelvis has a distinctive morphology. Dental development follows atypical patterns. These markers are not perfectly diagnostic from skeletal remains alone. They require careful analysis, comparison with population norms, and ideally corroboration from other historical sources, but they are real, and they have allowed researchers to make retrospective assessments of skeletal remains from royal tombs with a degree of confidence that was not possible even 50 years ago. Hungarian royal remains from the Arpad dynasty, which ruled the Kingdom of Hungary from its founding in the late 9th century until 1301, have been subject to exactly this kind of forensic analysis. The Arpads were buried across a number of Hungarian churches and royal sites, and a significant portion of their remains were excavated and studied in the 20th century. At least one set of remains from this dynasty has been noted by forensic researchers to show skeletal features potentially consistent with Down syndrome, though the specific individual and the study confirming this assessment requires verification before it can be stated with the confidence of the other cases in this video. What is significant about this line of research is what it represents for the future of this history. We are at the beginning of an era in which ancient DNA analysis, forensic anthropology, and archival research are converging in ways that will substantially change what we know about genetic conditions in historical populations. Royal tombs are among the best preserved and most extensively documented burial sites in the world. Royal families kept more detailed records than any other social class. The remains of kings and queens and their children are more likely to have survived, more likely to have been formally excavated, and more likely to have been analyzed than those of any other population. This means that as these methods improve, the history of Down syndrome in royal families is going to get significantly more detailed and significantly more populated with specific individuals and dates and names than anything we can document today. The child in the Flemish painting, the boy in Velázquez's portrait, the prince, hidden away on a Norfolk farm, they are almost certainly not the whole list. They are simply the ones the historical record, in its fragmented and imperfect state, has managed to preserve. Changing royal attitudes in the 20th century. The transformation in how royal families have treated Down syndrome across the 20th century is, by any measure, one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of any institution's relationship with disability. In 1905, a British prince with a developmental condition was quietly removed from public life, installed in a cottage on a country estate, and his death at age 13 was described by his father as a mercy. In 2021, the British royal family formally supported awareness campaigns organized by the Down Syndrome Association, and senior royal figures attended events celebrating the lives and achievements of people with the condition. That is 116 years. The medical reality changed first, and most dramatically. John Langdon Down's 1866 description of the condition was followed, nearly a century later, by French geneticist Jérôme Legeune's 1959 discovery that Down syndrome was caused by trisomy 21, the presence of a third copy of chromosome 21. This gave the condition a precise biological explanation for the first time, separating it definitively from the vague category of mental deficiency in which it had been grouped for generations. It also opened the door to understanding the specific medical vulnerabilities that came with it. The cardiac defects that had killed so many children with Down syndrome, including, potentially, Prince John, became surgically treatable through the 1970s and 1980s. Antibiotics addressed the respiratory infections to which people with Down syndrome were particularly susceptible. Educational inclusion programs developed evidence bases, showing that, with support, people with Down syndrome could achieve far more than any previous generation of physicians or educators had assumed possible. The result of these changes, cumulative across 6 decades, is that the average life expectancy for a person with Down syndrome in a developed country today exceeds 60 years compared to the 9 to 12 years that characterized the early 20th century. World Down Syndrome Day is observed annually on March 21st, a date chosen deliberately for its numerical reference to trisomy 21, the 21st chromosome. In Spain, members of extended royal circles have publicly supported Down syndrome advocacy organizations. The contrast with the centuries of concealment that preceded this moment is not subtle. Royal families spent hundreds of years erasing people with Down syndrome from their histories, hiding them in country cottages, omitting them from official portraits, describing their deaths as mercies, building elaborate institutional frameworks to make them invisible. The shift to active public support did not happen because royal families suddenly became more enlightened in isolation. It happened because the broader culture changed, medical science changed, and the political cost of concealment inverted. What had once been a scandal to acknowledge became a scandal to hide. The anonymous child in the Flemish painting, Francisco Lescano sitting with his playing cards in Velázquez's studio, Prince John running across the fields at Sandringham, they lived in the era of erasure. The story of how that era ended is still being written, and the people writing it include, increasingly, people with Down syndrome themselves. The House of Atreus. If you want to understand just how deeply a curse can sink its roots into a bloodline, start here, at the very beginning of recorded Western dysfunction, with a king who murdered his own son and served him to the gods as a dinner course. Tantalus, king of Mycena, slaughtered his son Pelops, boiled him, and presented the flesh at a divine banquet. The gods immediately recognized what they were eating and refused, reassembling Pelops from the pot, though Demeter, distracted by grief, had already eaten part of his shoulder. So the gods replaced it with carved ivory,
That image alone, a boy rebuilt from a cooking pot with a gleaming white shoulder, tells you what kind of family this is. Pelops went on to win his wife Hippodamia through a chariot race, but he won it by bribing the king's charioteer Myrtilus to sabotage the wheels, then threw Myrtilus into the sea to avoid paying him. And Myrtilus cursed the family with his dying breath. 2 generations of divine punishment stacked before the dynasty even properly begins. Pelops' sons, Atreus and Thyestes, then launched into a feud so savage it became the template for fraternal hatred for the next 3,000 years. Thyestes seduced Atreus' wife and stole a magical golden lamb that was the symbol of Mycenaean kingship. Atreus retaliated with something worse. He invited Thyestes to a reconciliation banquet, killed Thyestes' young sons, cooked them, and served them to their own father before revealing the children's hands and feet at the end of the meal as proof of what he had just consumed. Thyestes fled, cursing the entire line of Atreus to destruction. That curse landed with precision. Atreus' son, Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces at Troy, sacrificed his own daughter Iphigenia to the goddess Artemis to get favorable winds for the fleet, a decision his wife Clytemnestra never forgave. When Agamemnon returned from 10 years at Troy, bringing the Trojan princess Cassandra as a war prize, Clytemnestra murdered him in his bath, the greatest king in Greece, killed by his own wife in his own home, with an axe. Their son Orestes then killed Clytemnestra to avenge his father, which unleashed the Furies' ancient divine spirits of vengeance, specifically activated by the killing of blood relatives who pursued him across Greece, until Athens itself had to convene the first jury trial in history just to stop the supernatural punishment cycle. 5 generations: cannibalism, child sacrifice, spousal murder, matricide, and divine persecution. The House of Atreus did not have a curse so much as it had a tradition. The Ptolemaic dynasty. Most dynasties collapse from external pressure invasion, economic failure, military defeat. The Ptolemies were different. They were perfectly capable of destroying themselves from the inside with almost no outside help, and they did it for 275 years with extraordinary consistency. Founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals after Alexander died without a clear heir in 323 BCE, the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt as a Greek-speaking monarchy that adopted Egyptian religious traditions for legitimacy while keeping Greek culture for themselves. The policy that defined them most was marriage. Specifically, they married each other. Brother married sister, uncle married niece, cousins married cousins. This was justified through Egyptian religious tradition. Pharaohs were divine, and divinity should not be diluted by commoner blood, but the practical result was a family tree that looked less like a tree and more like a knot. Ptolemy VIII, known to his own subjects as Physcon, meaning potbelly, is a useful illustration of where this led. He ruled Egypt twice, in between being driven out by his own sister wife Cleopatra II, whom he had previously tried to murder. When he returned to power with the help of his niece wife Cleopatra III, yes, he had married his sister and his niece, he wanted to send Cleopatra II a message. He killed the son he shared with her, dismembered the body, packed the pieces into a chest, and had it delivered to her as a birthday present. This was not a regime with a few dark episodes. This was a regime in which that story does not even rank as the most disturbing event. The famous Cleopatra VII, the last one, the one who actually spoke Egyptian and conducted simultaneous affairs with both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, inherited a dynasty already half destroyed by its own internal violence. When Rome closed in and Antony's forces collapsed, both she and Antony died by suicide within days of each other in 30 BCE. The Ptolemies did not fall. They simply ran out of family to kill. The Julio-Claudian dynasty. Rome's first imperial dynasty lasted 96 years, produced 5 emperors, and managed to make every single one of them either a murderer, a victim, or both. Augustus, who built the dynasty, spent his reign watching his carefully chosen heirs die one after another, his nephew Marcellus, his grandsons Gaius and Lucius with contemporaries, noting that his wife Livia had a suspicious habit of outliving everyone who stood between her son Tiberius and the throne. Tiberius himself, once emperor, retreated to the island of Capri and governed Rome through terror and informers while engaging in private behavior that the historian Suetonius documented in detail lurid enough that translators in the Victorian era left sections Latin. Then came Caligula, who ruled for less than 4 years, but packed enough catastrophe into them to last a generation. He may have suffered severe brain damage from an illness shortly after taking power, and what followed was a reign of executions, sexual violence, theatrical cruelty, and possibly the most famous act of deliberate political absurdism in ancient history, reportedly appointing his horse, Incitatus, to the consulship. Claudius came next, the family's designated fool kept alive, precisely because nobody considered him a threat and actually governed reasonably competently before being poisoned with mushrooms in 54 CE.
almost certainly by his own wife Agrippina the Younger, so that her son Nero could take the throne. Nero thanked her by having her executed 6 years later. He then kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death during an argument, performed on stage in Greece as a singer and actor while the empire frayed, and died in 68 CE, fleeing his own military, reportedly weeping and declaring, "What an artist dies with me," as he arranged his own death. 5 emperors. Not one of them died peacefully in bed, having passed power smoothly to a chosen successor. The Julio-Claudians did not merely have a bad run, they industrialized dysfunction and called it governance. The House of Plantagenet. The Plantagenets ruled England from 1154 to 1485, which is long enough that you might expect a few stable reigns in there. You would be wrong about the proportion. The dynasty opened with Henry II, whose knights murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, on the floor of the cathedral in 1170, reportedly triggered by Henry saying, in frustration, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Henry spent years afterward doing public penance, walking barefoot through Canterbury while monks flogged him. Henry also faced open rebellion from his own sons, coordinated with the active encouragement of their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, whom Henry eventually imprisoned for 16 years to stop her from organizing them. His sons still rebelled. His son John, who came to power in 1199, lost nearly all English territory in France within 5 years, was excommunicated by the Pope, and was then forced by his own barons to sign Magna Carta in 1215 at effective sword point, after which he immediately had it annulled, which triggered a French invasion of England. John died the following year of dysentery during a military campaign, reportedly having just lost the crown jewels in a tidal estuary crossing. Edward II was deposed by his own wife Isabella and her lover Mortimer in 1326 and almost certainly murdered in Berkeley Castle the following year. Richard II was starved to death in captivity after his cousin Henry IV took the throne. Richard III, in the dynasty's final act, allegedly had his 2 young nephews, the princes in the Tower, aged 12 and 9, murdered to secure his own claim, a crime that has generated scholarly argument for 500 years. The dynasty ended through the Wars of the Roses, roughly 30 years of civil war between the Lancastrian and Yorkist branches of the same family. The Plantagenets' last major achievement was destroying themselves. The House of Valois. The Valois ruled France from 1328 to 1589, a period bookended by the Hundred Years' War on one end and the French Wars of Religion on the other, which gives you a reasonable sense of the general atmosphere. The most extraordinary individual in the dynasty's history may be Charles VI, who developed severe and progressive mental illness in his 20s. He experienced episodes in which he failed to recognize his wife or children, believed he was made of glass, and would shatter if anyone touched him, and ran screaming through palace corridors in states of complete dissociation. During these episodes, which could last for months, France was effectively ungoverned, and the resulting power vacuum allowed English forces and rival French factions to tear the country apart. His successor, Henry II, managed to end the Hundred Years' War and consolidate the kingdom, then died in 1559 from injuries sustained in a jousting tournament, when a lance fragment punched through his visor, entered his eye socket, and drove into his brain. He lingered in agony for 10 days before dying. His widow, Catherine de' Medici, then spent the next 30 years maneuvering her sons onto the throne in sequence Francis II, Charles IX, Henry III, each reigned progressively more unstable than the last. Charles IX, under Catherine's influence, authorized the assassination of Protestant Huguenot leaders during the Street Bartholomew's Day Massacre in August 1572, a targeted killing that immediately spiraled beyond anyone's control into nationwide massacres, leaving somewhere between 5,000 and 30,000 dead across France. Henry III, the last Valois king, was stabbed in the abdomen by a Dominican friar named Jacques Clément, who had requested a private audience and concealed a knife in his robe. Henry III died the following morning, reportedly naming the Protestant Henry of Navarre as his successor with his last coherent words, thus ending a Catholic dynasty by bequeathing France to a Protestant. The House of Habsburg. If the Valois destroyed themselves through violence and bad luck, the Spanish Habsburgs managed something rarer. They destroyed themselves through mathematics. The Habsburg policy of intermarriage within the royal family, cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, the same bloodlines looping back through each other generation after generation, was a deliberate strategy to keep power consolidated and alliances tight. A 2019 study published in Scientific Reports analyzed 11 generations of Habsburg genealogy and calculated that Charles II of Spain had an inbreeding coefficient of approximately 0.254, higher than the expected coefficient of a child born to 2 siblings. He was, in measurable genetic terms, more inbred than if his parents had been brother and sister. The physical consequences were visible and documented. The Habsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism so severe that Charles II could not bring his upper and lower teeth together, making it nearly impossible to chew food properly or speak clearly. Chronic illness throughout his short life, and complete infertility, meaning the most powerful dynasty in European history ended because its last Spanish representative could not produce an heir. He died in 1700 at 38 years old, and his death triggered the War of Spanish Succession. But Charles II is not even the Habsburg dynasty's most individually tragic figure. That distinction arguably belongs to Juana, later called Juana the Mad, who may have been suffering genuine mental illness or may have been a politically inconvenient queen who was labeled mad and imprisoned for it. What is not disputed is that she was locked in the castle of Tordesillas in 1509 by her own father, and remained there until her death in 1555, 46 years of confinement, while her son Charles I ruled in her name without apparent urgency about her condition. The House of Romanov. The Romanovs ruled Russia for 304 years, from 1613 to 1918, across a country so vast that the journey from one end to the other takes 7 time zones, and they managed to be catastrophic at a scale proportional to the territory. Peter the Great, who modernized Russia, built St. Petersburg on a swamp, using forced labor that killed tens of thousands, and tortured and imprisoned his own son Alexei in the Peter and Paul Fortress in 1718, with Alexei dying there. A century later, Tsar Paul I was so spectacularly hated by the Russian nobility that a group of officers entered his bedroom in St. Petersburg's Mikhailovsky Castle on the night of the 23rd of March 1801, and strangled him, with his son Alexander reportedly aware that a coup was being planned and choosing not to stop it. But the dynasty's most operatically cursed chapter belongs to its final generation. Nicholas II inherited an empire already straining under industrialization, inequality, and military decline, ignored repeated warnings that reform was necessary, led Russia into a catastrophic war with Japan in 1904-05, and then into the First World War in 1914, and watched the entire structure collapse into revolution. Threading through the final years is Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic peasant with no formal religious training, who had attached himself to the royal family because he appeared able to alleviate the suffering of the hemophiliac Tsarevich Alexei through means that remain unexplained. Alexandra trusted him absolutely. Nicholas trusted Alexandra. Rasputin effectively influenced state appointments and policy during the war years, which the nobility found intolerable. In December 1916, a group of nobles killed him in what became one of history's most embellished murders, poisoned, shot, beaten, and drowned, according to various accounts. On the 17th of July 1918, in a basement in Yekaterinburg, the entire immediate Romanov family, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters and their sick 13-year-old son Alexei were shot by Bolshevik forces. 304 years of imperial rule ended in a basement. The House of Windsor. Britain's current royal family has been the House of Windsor only since the 17th of July, 1917, when George V changed the family name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the actual German dynastic name, because Britain was in the middle of fighting Germany. The name change is the dynasty's founding act, and it sets the tone perfectly. Image management as survival strategy. Edward VIII took the throne in January 1936 and abdicated in December of the same year, less than 12 months, to marry Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had been divorced twice. Edward and Wallis spent the war years in the Bahamas, where he had been appointed governor partly to keep him at a safe distance, under documented suspicion of Nazi sympathies following his 1937 visit to Germany, during which he met Adolf Hitler. Prince Philip's sisters all married German princes, several with documented Nazi affiliations, and were excluded from the 1947 royal wedding. Princess Diana's marriage to Prince Charles, announced as a fairy tale in 1981, had collapsed visibly and completely by the early 1990s, with documented eating disorders, reported suicide attempts, affairs confirmed on both sides, and a BBC Panorama interview in November 1995, watched by 23 million people in Britain, in which Diana described the marriage's failure with a precision that made comfortable denial impossible. She died in a Paris car tunnel on the 31st of August 1997, being pursued by paparazzi at speed. Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein, Virginia Giuffre's allegations of sexual abuse, and his 2019 BBC Newsnight interview led to his removal from royal duties. Prince Harry and Meghan's 2021 interview with Oprah Winfrey included allegations of racism within the institution regarding their son's skin color. The House of Windsor's defining skill is survival through a combination of silence, slow adaptation, and the sheer weight of institutional inertia.
The Joseon Dynasty, the curse of Prince Sado. Korea's Joseon Dynasty ruled for over 500 years, from 1392 to 1897, and the Joseon delivered an episode of internal horror so specific and so well documented that it has never stopped reverberating through Korean history and culture. Prince Sado was the crown prince, heir to King Yeongjo, and by his mid-20s he had developed severe mental illness. The behavioral record documented by those around him describes violent episodes in which he killed palace servants, court women, and members of his household, sometimes apparently without clear motive. The political situation this created for his father was, by the standards of dynastic governance, genuinely impossible. Executing a crown prince openly would have required formal justification, created a succession crisis, and potentially delegitimized the throne itself. Leaving him alive meant a mentally ill, violent man would eventually become king. Yeongjo's solution, carried out in the summer of 1762, was to order his son into a wooden rice chest, the kind used to store grain and seal it. Sado died inside it 8 days later, in the summer heat of the palace grounds, while his father and the court waited. He was 27 years old. The witness to all of this, and the person who documented it in extraordinary detail, was Sado's wife, Lady Haegyong, who wrote about the events across decades in a memoir called The Hanjeongnak, completing it around 1805. It is one of the only first-person accounts written by a woman from inside a royal family in pre-modern Korean history. Sado's son became King Jeongjo, widely regarded as one of the most accomplished rulers in Korean history, who spent much of his reign attempting to rehabilitate his father's memory. The House of Grimaldi. The House of Grimaldi has ruled Monaco since 1297, making it the oldest ruling dynasty in the world still in power. And it operates under a curse that, at this point, has 700 years of supporting evidence. According to tradition, the curse originated with the dynasty's founding moment itself. François Grimaldi disguised himself as a Franciscan monk to infiltrate and capture the fortress of Monaco in 1297, and a local woman cursed the family in response, decreeing that no Grimaldi would ever find true happiness in marriage. Whether you believe in curses or not, the track record across 7 centuries is statistically remarkable. Prince Rainier III married Grace Kelly in 1956, one of the most famous actresses in Hollywood, in a ceremony so widely covered that it was broadcast to 30 million television viewers across Europe. Grace Kelly died on the 14th of September, 1982, when her car went off a cliff road above Monaco, the same stretch of road she had driven in Alfred Hitchcock's film To Catch a Thief, almost 30 years earlier. Her daughter Stephanie was in the car and survived. The investigation found that Grace had suffered a stroke before losing control, but the location, the timing, and the circumstances ensured that the story attached itself immediately to the Grimaldi curse narrative. Princess Caroline's romantic history includes a first husband who died in a speedboat accident in 1990, a second marriage that ended in public scandal, and a third husband whose public behavior generated enough tabloid coverage across Europe to constitute a subplot of its own. Princess Stephanie's marriages and relationships played out almost entirely in public, including a marriage to her own bodyguard. Prince Albert II acknowledged 2 children from different relationships before his 2011 marriage to Charlene Wittstock, a former South African Olympic swimmer, who then spent most of 2021 inches South Africa being treated for a serious infection following a procedure, unable to return to Monaco for nearly a year, a situation that prompted sustained international speculation. Monaco covers 2.02 square kilometers, roughly the size of Central Park in New York City. In a country that small, there is nowhere to hide, and the cracks have been appearing, faithfully, for 700 years. Hemophilia B. Queen Victoria ruled over the largest empire in human history and inadvertently planted a genetic time bomb inside the bloodlines of nearly every royal family in Europe. The disease was hemophilia B, a deficiency of factor IX, the protein that allows blood to clot properly. Without it, a bruise doesn't fade, it deepens. A joint bleed doesn't stop, it swells until the joint is destroyed. A minor fall doesn't heal, it kills. Victoria was almost certainly a spontaneous carrier, meaning the mutation likely arose in her own DNA rather than being inherited, which is a bitter irony given what came next, because while inbreeding didn't create the mutation, it guaranteed the mutation spread. Victoria had 9 children, 42 grandchildren, and the determined habit of marrying them to each other and to cousins across the crowned heads of Europe. Her son Leopold, Duke of Albany, suffered from the disease his entire life and died at 30 from a brain hemorrhage triggered by a minor fall. Her daughters Beatrice and Alice carried the gene without being affected and passed it quietly into the German, Spanish, and Russian royal lines. The most catastrophic destination was Russia, where Alice's daughter Alexandra married Tsar Nicholas II and gave birth to Alexei Romanov in 1904.
the long-awaited heir to the Russian throne and a boy who spent much of his childhood screaming, his joints filled with blood after ordinary childhood bumps, his knees swelled to the size of cantaloupes. Alexandra's desperation to save her son led her to Rasputin, a Siberian mystic whose ability to calm Alexei's episodes gave him a political foothold in the Russian court that destabilized the entire empire in the years leading to 1917. A 2009 genetic analysis of the Romanov remains confirmed the specific mutation as hemophilia B. The disease that started with a single mutation in one woman's DNA ended with a dynasty's collapse, a mystic's political ascent, and the execution of a family in a basement in Yekaterinburg. Porphyria. King George III of Britain ruled for 60 years, lost the American colonies, and spent the final decade of his life blind, deaf, and confined to Windsor Castle, wandering the halls in a purple-trimmed dressing gown, talking to people who weren't there. The suspected cause is porphyria, a group of metabolic disorders affecting the production of heme, the compound that gives blood its red color. When heme production breaks down, toxic intermediates accumulate in the body, attacking the nervous system and producing a cascade that looks, to everyone watching, exactly like madness. George III experienced at least 4 major documented episodes of acute illness across his reign, characterized by severe abdominal cramping, muscle weakness, racing pulse, rambling incoherent speech, and the detail that contemporaries found most disturbing, his urine turned a dark port wine purple. During his worst episodes, he failed to recognize family members, made inappropriate sexual remarks to ladies of the court, and once attempted to dash the Prince of Wales's head against a wall. His doctors, working with 18th-century tools, responded with bleeding, blistering, and physical restraint, treatments that almost certainly made the neurological symptoms worse. The Regency Act of 1811 transferred governing power to the future George IV on the grounds of his father's incapacity, meaning a metabolic enzyme defect effectively rewrote British constitutional law. The porphyria diagnosis, first formally proposed in 1966, is not universally accepted. Some researchers argue bipolar disorder or arsenic poisoning from his own medications better explains the pattern, and a 2011 re-examination of hair samples did find elevated arsenic levels, but the hereditary pattern across multiple generations of the same inbred line remains difficult to explain away. The Habsburg jaw. No family in European history made inbreeding into a political strategy as systematically or as visibly as the Habsburgs, and no family paid for it as obviously. The dynasty's defining physical feature, a protruding lower jaw so severe that the lower teeth sat entirely in front of the upper teeth, appeared mildly in Philip I of Castile in the late 1400s and worsened with every subsequent generation of cousin marriage until it reached its terminal expression in Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, whose jaw was pronounced that he could not close his mouth, could barely chew food, and drooled constantly. A landmark 2019 study analyzed portraits and historical records of 66 Habsburg individuals across 11 generations, directly correlating the severity of jaw deformity with each individual's calculated coefficient of inbreeding. The correlation was nearly perfect. The more inbred the individual, the worse the jaw. The deformity is caused by recessive genetic variants that, in a normally diverse population, would almost never meet in the same individual. But the Habsburgs didn't marry a normally diverse population. They married each other. Uncles married nieces. First cousins married first cousins, generation after generation, because every marriage outside the dynasty risked diluting the concentration of power, land, and title that the family had spent centuries accumulating. By the time Charles II wore the Spanish crown, he represented 11 generations of concentrated inbreeding, with a personal inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, higher than the theoretical value for a child born of full siblings, intellectual disability, and developmental delay. Charles II of Spain is the most extreme documented case of inbreeding-caused developmental impairment in any ruling monarch in recorded history. The jaw was actually the least of his problems. He didn't walk until he was 8 years old. He didn't speak clearly until he was 10. Even as an adult, his speech was so impaired by his jaw deformity and what appears to have been global developmental delay that foreign ambassadors stationed in Madrid reported struggling to understand him. One French ambassador wrote that Charles appeared to be always dying. Real power throughout his reign rested with court factions, religious advisors, and his mother Mariana of Austria. He suffered epileptic episodes. He experienced hallucinations serious enough that the church was brought in to perform exorcisms. His own court genuinely debated whether he was demonically possessed, which tells you everything about the gap between the supernatural explanations available to a 17th century court and genetic reality nobody had the framework to understand. He married twice and produced no children from either marriage, likely due to infertility caused by the same hormonal and developmental abnormality affecting every other system in his body. A contemporary autopsy account described his internal organs as in a state of extraordinary deterioration: a shrunken heart, rotten intestines, a brain reportedly filled with water. He died in 1700 at 38, ending the Spanish Habsburg line entirely, and his death without an heir triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped European borders and killed hundreds of thousands of people. Cleft palate. The Habsburg jaw gets the fame, but cleft palate ran quietly through the same craniofacial developmental system, appearing across both the Habsburg dynasty and centuries earlier the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt from 305 BC to 30 BC, and practiced sibling marriage as deliberate divine policy for most of that period. Facial abnormalities including features consistent with cleft palate appear in coinage and written descriptions of several rulers. The mechanism is clear. The Ptolemaic policy of brother-sister marriage, maintained on the theological grounds that they were living gods whose divine bloodline must not be contaminated with mortal genetics, drove their genome toward the same endpoint every inbred animal population reaches when left to itself long enough: the surface expression of harmful recessive variants. Cleft palate before modern surgery wasn't merely cosmetic. In infancy, it made feeding nearly impossible. Infants with an unrepaired cleft cannot create the suction needed to nurse, meaning survival depended entirely on wet nurses using specialized feeding methods, and infant mortality was dramatically elevated. Survivors faced chronic ear infections, significant speech impediments, and a lifetime of social visibility in courts, where physical perfection was considered a divine endorsement of royal legitimacy. Epilepsy. The Ptolemaic dynasty didn't just produce structural deformities, it produced neurological instability as well. Ptolemy X and Ptolemy XII, the latter being Cleopatra VII's father, are among those whose described episodes: sudden collapses, convulsive episodes, periods of apparent unconsciousness followed by confusion, align with descriptions of generalized epilepsy. Certain forms of epilepsy have strongly recessive genetic components, meaning sibling marriage, the Ptolemaic standard from Ptolemy II Philadelphus onward, would have dramatically elevated the probability of a child inheriting two copies of defective neurological variants. What makes these cases historically interesting is the cultural translation layer. In the ancient world, a ruler who collapsed in a seizure didn't necessarily lose political authority. They might gain it. Epilepsy in Greek and Egyptian tradition carried associations with divine possession and sacred contact with the gods. A king who fell to the ground shaking during a public ceremony might have his episode immediately reframed by priests as divine ecstasy. This reframing was politically useful in the short term and medically catastrophic in the long term, because it meant the actual neurological crisis went unaddressed, while the dynasty continued the marriage practices generating it. Mental illness and depression. Juana I of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad, was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the mother of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and the legal queen of the most powerful empire in 16th century Europe. She was also a prisoner for 46 years. When her husband Philip the Handsome died suddenly in 1506, Juana's grief reportedly became something that alarmed her court. She refused to allow his coffin to be sealed and buried, allegedly keeping it with her and, in some accounts, opening it to be near his remains. Her father Ferdinand and later her son Charles both had compelling reasons to keep Juana classified as mentally incapable of ruling. She was the legitimate queen, and as long as she was sane, they were governing in her name without her consent. She was confined at the castle of Tordesillas in 1509 and did not leave until her death in 1555, a period of 46 years during which the empire she legally owned was ruled by the men who kept her locked up. Whether Juana suffered from a genuine psychiatric condition or whether her madness was primarily a political construction, amplified by those who benefited from her incapacity, remains unresolved. What is clearer is the genetic context. Juana was the product of a dynasty already accumulating recessive load through cousin marriage, and her own children and grandchildren would continue the pattern that eventually produced Charles II a century later: stillbirth and infant mortality. Queen Anne of Britain holds a record that no monarch in European history has come close to matching, and it is not a record anyone would want. She was pregnant at least 17 times and did not produce a single child who survived to adulthood. Most pregnancies ended in stillbirth. Several children died within hours hours or days of birth. One daughter lived to 2 months. Her one child who reached childhood, William Duke of Gloucester, was born in 1689 with an abnormally large head consistent with hydrocephalus, suffered through a childhood of chronic illness, and died in 1700 at the age of 11. Anne's reproductive history is so extreme that it defies explanation by random misfortune alone. Researchers have retrospectively proposed antiphospholipid syndrome, an autoimmune clotting disorder with a genetic component that causes the body to attack the placenta, as a possible explanation. Anne was the product of the Stuart royal line, a family with documented inbreeding across multiple generations. She aged rapidly through repeated pregnancies and losses, becoming increasingly reclusive and physically deteriorated through her reign. She died in 1714 at 49, in visible physical ruin, having outlived every single one of her children. The political consequence of her empty nursery was that the Act of Settlement of 1701 had already redirected the British succession to the House of Hanover, the same line that would later produce George III and his Porphyria. Dwarfism and growth disorders. The Spanish Habsburg court of the 17th century is one of the most extensively documented royal courts in history, partly because Diego Velázquez spent decades painting it with meticulous precision, and what those paintings record is a court populated with individuals whose physical dimensions diverged sharply from expected norms. Court dwarfs appear in multiple Velázquez canvases, most famously Las Meninas of 1656. Some court dwarfs of this period were unrelated individuals employed in court service, a common European practice. But the frequency with which growth abnormalities and developmental delays appeared across the Habsburg family itself, in individuals who were not employed entertainers but blood relatives, reflects the same recessive genetic accumulation producing the jaw deformities and the cognitive impairments in the same bodies. Multiple forms of dwarfism follow recessive inheritance patterns. In a family where parents are themselves related, the probability that both carry the same variant rises dramatically with each generation of close relative marriage. The tragic footnote is that the court's practice of surrounding the royal family with individuals who had the same conditions the royal family was developing in itself created a kind of visual normalization. The genetic consequences of inbreeding became part of the court's aesthetic furniture rather than a warning anyone was equipped to read. Hereditary deafness. Hereditary deafness is genetically one of the most complex sensory disorders known. Over 100 genes have been identified as contributing to various forms of inherited hearing loss, but many of the most common forms follow recessive inheritance patterns. In a population practicing sustained cousin marriage, the mathematical probability of two carriers reproducing rises sharply with each generation, because the carrier frequency within the bloodline is not randomly distributed. The Medici family of Florence, technically a mercantile dynasty rather than a royal one, but wielding equivalent political power and practicing cousin marriage extensively to consolidate wealth and influence, documented hearing loss across several family members in ways that historians have noted but rarely analyzed through the genetic framework the pattern deserves. A ruler with significant hearing loss in a court structured entirely around spoken communication was functionally impaired in ways that advisors and enemies could and did exploit. The accommodations that courts developed around hearing-impaired rulers look, in retrospect, less like administrative efficiency and more like workarounds for a condition the court couldn't acknowledge without undermining the ruler's authority. Immune deficiency. The most invisible consequence of royal inbreeding is also, statistically, the most lethal. Inbreeding reduces genetic diversity across the entire genome, including a region called the major histocompatibility complex, which governs how the immune system identifies and responds to pathogens. Lower diversity means the immune system recognizes fewer threats, responds more slowly to novel infections, and fails to mount adequate defenses against pathogens that a genetically diverse immune system would handle without serious illness. In the Spanish Habsburg line, royal childhood mortality in the 17th century was dramatically elevated compared to Spanish commoners of the same period, a counterintuitive result, given that royal children had access to better food, warmer rooms, more medical attention, and protection from the environmental poverty that killed commoner children. The conditions that actually killed royal children, pneumonia, measles, recurring fevers, were infections where immune response quality determined survival. The Romanov children showed patterns of unusual susceptibility to respiratory illness and infection across multiple siblings beyond Alexei's documented hemophilia. Immune deficiency as an inbreeding consequence doesn't appear in portraits or autopsy records. It appears in graveyards, in the extraordinary concentration of small royal coffins in dynasty chapels, in the genealogical trees that terminate with children who died at 2 and 4 and 7 for causes that shouldn't have been fatal. Fertility decline and genetic extinction. Every item on this list is a symptom. This one is the diagnosis. Inbreeding depression, the reduction in biological fitness that accumulates as a genome becomes increasingly homozygous, is one of the most consistently documented phenomena in biology, observed across mammals, birds, plants, and insects, and its endpoint in any sufficiently inbred population is always the same. The population fails to reproduce. For royal dynasties, which organize their entire political existence around the imperative of producing heirs, this biological endpoint was also a political one. The Spanish Habsburg line ended in 1700 when Charles II died without children after 2 marriages. The direct Valois line of France ended similarly. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which practiced sibling marriage as deliberate divine policy for nearly 300 years, produced Cleopatra VII, a ruler of extraordinary individual capability, and then collapsed entirely when she died in 30 BC. The Habsburg inbreeding coefficient of 0.254 for Charles II compares to approximately 0.0045 for Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, who were themselves third cousins, a degree of relation that sounds close until you place it next to 11 generations of uncle-niece marriages. What history records as political failure, dynasties running out of heirs, succession crises, wars fought over empty thrones, is often genetic failure in political clothing. These families didn't lose power because of bad luck or divine disfavor. They engineered their own biological extinction one cousin marriage at a time, prioritizing the purity of bloodlines over the viability of the bodies those bloodlines were supposed to produce.
Tutankhamun, the boy king of Egypt's 18th dynasty, was buried with 130 walking canes, and for a long time historians assumed they were ceremonial symbols of power rather than tools of survival. They were not. CT scans and DNA analysis conducted in 2010 and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association revealed that Tutankhamun was a young man whose body was quietly collapsing from the inside, the product of generations of deliberate inbreeding within the royal line. His parents are now believed to have been siblings. DNA matched 2 unidentified mummies, designated KV35YL and KV35EL, as his probable mother and father, and the result was a genetic catastrophe compressed into a reign that lasted less than a decade. He had Kolar disease too, a condition in which the bones of the foot begin to die from interrupted blood supply, leaving the tissue dark, necrotic, and structurally unreliable. His left foot was clubbed, twisting the limb inward and downward, so that walking on flat ground was a constant managed negotiation with pain. He also had scoliosis of the spine and, according to some analyses, a cleft palate. Multiple strains of Plasmodium falciparum malaria were confirmed in his remains, and the combination of bone disease, spinal deformity, immune compromise, and parasitic infection likely killed him around age 18 or 19. The golden funeral mask that made him famous shows a serene, perfect face, symmetrical, ageless, almost divine. Beneath the linen wrappings was a withered, deformed foot attached to a teenager who ruled an empire he could barely walk across. King Charles II of Spain. If you wanted to design a human being with the maximum possible genetic damage through inbreeding alone, and you had several generations to work with, you might end up with something close to Charles II of Spain, and the Habsburg dynasty essentially did exactly that without meaning to. By the time Charles was born in 1661, the family tree had folded back on itself so many times that geneticists calculating his inbreeding coefficient in a 2009 PLOS, one study arrived at a figure of 0.254, which is higher than the coefficient expected from a direct sibling pairing. Philip I, the dynasty's foundational figure, appeared 14 times within just a few generations of Charles's lineage. The physical results were staggering. The Habsburg jaw, a mandibular prognathism that caused the lower jaw to protrude dramatically beyond the upper, was so extreme in Charles that he could not bring his teeth together to chew food. His tongue was reportedly so enlarged that he drooled continuously and spoke with significant difficulty, and contemporaries described conversations with him as exercises in patience and interpretation. He could not walk until age 8. He could not speak until age 4. He vomited frequently, suffered episodes of sudden unconsciousness, and his limbs were weak to the point where courtiers routinely assisted him with tasks that healthy adults perform without thought. He had two wives, Marie-Louise of Orléans and then Mariana of Neuburg, and produced 0 surviving children, a biological outcome that was never in serious doubt given the severity of his condition. He died in November 1700 at age 38, his body essentially exhausted before it had ever been fully functional, and the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line triggered the War of Spanish Succession, redrawing the political map of Europe. One man's genetic collapse producing one of the continent's defining 18th century conflicts. Richard III of England. In September 2012, workers excavating a Leicester car park discovered a skeleton that would become the most scientifically examined set of royal remains in British history. The bones were confirmed via mitochondrial DNA, matched to living descendants to be those of Richard III, last Plantagenet, King of England, who had died at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August 1485, and had been buried, then forgotten beneath what eventually became a municipal parking lot. What the skeleton revealed was striking, not because it matched the monstrous portrait Shakespeare had constructed in his famous play, but because it partially did and partially didn't. The spine showed severe adolescent-onset idiopathic scoliosis, a dramatic-shaped lateral curvature estimated at somewhere between 65 and 85 degrees, which would have made Richard's right shoulder visibly higher than his left and given him a noticeably asymmetrical silhouette. This was not a birth defect in the strictest congenital sense, but a condition that developed during his teenage years and progressed to the point of medical significance. What Shakespeare described as a withered arm, however, found no support in the bones, no evidence of a shortened or malformed upper limb existed, suggesting that the Tudor propagandists who shaped Shakespeare's source material had invented or exaggerated that detail to tie physical deformity to moral corruption in the audience's mind. The skeleton also contained evidence of roundworm infection, a reminder that parasites were no respecter of royal blood. The skull bore multiple perimortem injuries consistent with battle wounds, including a severe strike to the base of the cranium, suggesting that whatever Richard's physical limitations, he died fighting rather than fleeing. The gap between the monster of the portraits and the complicated, imperfect man in the ground is one of the more unexpectedly human gaps in English royal history. James VI of Scotland and the First of England. No autopsy survives and no skeleton has been analyzed, so everything known about James Stuart's physical condition comes from the people who watched him move through rooms, drink from cups, and hold court for decades, and they wrote about it with the frankness that diplomatic dispatches allow when they're not intended for the subject's eyes. Ambassadors from France, Venice, and the Spanish Netherlands consistently described a king whose legs were weak and unreliable, who leaned on attendants during public appearances, and who moved with a gait that observers found at odds with the authority his position demanded. His tongue was described as too large for his mouth, causing him to speak thickly and to lose liquid from his lips when drinking, characteristics consistent with macroglossia, though no formal diagnosis is possible at this distance. He was famously unable to sit still, fidgeting and shifting throughout audiences in a way that struck contemporaries as undignified, and that some modern medical historians have connected to possible neurological or musculoskeletal conditions, with hypotheses ranging from rickets affecting his lower limbs to Perthes disease causing avascular necrosis of the femoral head, though all such retroactive diagnoses remain speculative. What makes James particularly interesting is the contrast between his physical presentation and his intellectual output. He authored works on theology, demonology, kingship, and tobacco, and was by most scholarly accounts a genuinely formidable thinker operating inside a body that consistently undermined the performance of majesty. Whether his conditions were congenital, the result of early childhood illness, or some combination of both, his court adapted around them, and the record of that adaptation is one of the more quietly revealing windows into how royal physical disability was managed and minimized in the early modern period. Carlos II of Austria. He is not Charles II of Spain, but he is his ancestor, and his case matters precisely because of that relationship, because watching Carlos II of Austria reveals the mechanism in motion before the catastrophe arrives. Born in 1540 and married in 1571 to Maria Anna of Bavaria, who was herself a Habsburg on her mother's side, Carlos added another tight loop to a genealogical structure that was already dangerously self-referential. The Habsburg jaw was present and pronounced eating and speaking were documented difficulties, and contemporary accounts describe chronic illness throughout his life. likely reflecting the immune system compromises that accompany severe inbreeding, even when they don't produce the full terminal cascade seen in his Spanish descendants. What makes his case valuable beyond his individual suffering is the documentary record it creates. Court portraits of the Habsburg line across multiple generations show the jaw deformity appearing, then deepening, then becoming more extreme, like a physical argument written in oil paint across the walls of European palaces. Carlos's children showed greater severity than he did. Their children showed greater severity still. The decision to continue marrying within the family, generation after generation, despite watching the jawline push further forward and the health deteriorate further with each iteration, is one of the more remarkable examples of institutional denial in European history. A dynasty watching itself physically collapse in the mirrors of its own portraiture and choosing not to change course. Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor, was Carlos's son. Charles II of Spain, the terminal case, was his great-grandson. The line between them is a straight one, measurable in portraits and in bone. King Edward VI of England. He was born on the 12th of October, 1537, and his mother Jane Seymour was dead 12 days later, likely from puerperal fever, making Edward's entry into the world. Both the dynastic triumph Henry VIII had spent a decade and two discarded queens pursuing an immediate personal catastrophe. He was premature, fragile from the start, and the detailed health records maintained by Tudor court physicians document a childhood of recurring fevers, respiratory infections, and a constitutional weakness that responded poorly to everything the era's medicine could offer. For the first years of his reign, he became king at 9. He was functional enough, presiding over a Protestant reformation of the English Church, with advisors doing the heavy governing. Then, in 1552, measles struck. Edward survived it, but whatever reserve of physical resilience he had possessed was apparently consumed in the process, because what followed was a deterioration of extraordinary speed and horror. His physicians documented the loss of his hair, his fingernails, and his toenails. His skin darkened. His legs swelled to the point where he could not lie flat without his breathing becoming labored to the point of suffocation. He lost the ability to speak clearly in his final weeks. Modern medical historians believe the primary cause was pulmonary tuberculosis, possibly complicated by a suppurative pulmonary disorder developing alongside it, though some researchers have raised the possibility that arsenic present in the medicines of the era accelerated or complicated his decline. In desperation, his physicians eventually handed his care to an unlicensed healer, a wise woman whose remedies accomplished nothing. He died on the 6th of July, 1553, age 15, having reigned for 6 years without ever being well enough to govern on his own terms. His face in his final portraits already carrying the hollowed, pale quality of a body that had been losing its argument with itself for years. Don Carlos of Spain. Born in 1545 to parents who were double first cousins, his father Philip II of Spain and his mother Maria Manuela of Portugal shared both sets of grandparents. Don Carlos arrived into a genetic situation that was already severely compressed, and the physical signs were visible early: a reportedly misshapen skull, uneven shoulders, and a thin, sickly constitution that contrasted sharply with the expectations placed on the heir to the most powerful monarchy in Europe. He ate compulsively, and in patterns contemporaries found disturbing. He ran fevers with abnormal regularity and had extreme sensitivity to temperature. Then, in 1562, at age 17, he fell down a staircase at Alcalá de Henares while reportedly chasing a servant girl, fractured his skull, and fell into a coma. The most famous anatomist of the 16th century, Andreas Vesalius, whose work had revolutionized European understanding of the human body, was summoned to perform a trepanation, drilling into the prince's skull to relieve pressure, and Carlos survived. But the person who emerged from that recovery was measurably worse than the person who had fallen down the stairs. The rages that followed were documented in court records as ungovernable. He threatened courtiers, attempted to throw a page from a window, physically assaulted the Duke of Alba, and on at least one occasion, reportedly demanded that his bootmaker eat the boots he had made incorrectly. Philip II, facing a son who was both the heir to his throne and a person who could not be safely allowed near power, made a decision that had no good options. He had Carlos arrested and imprisoned in January 1568. 6 months later, on the 24th of July 1568, Carlos was dead in his cell at age 23. The cause still debated: a prolonged voluntary fast, the effects of imprisonment on an already fragile body, or something else entirely.
His story became the basis for Schiller's 1787 play and Verdi's 1867 opera, both of which transformed him into a romantic, tragic hero, which he may or may not have been, but which he certainly was not in the manner either work depicts. King George III of Great Britain. He reigned for 59 years, longer than any British king before him, and spent the final decade of that reign completely blind, completely deaf, and completely disconnected from reality, locked in a room at Windsor Castle, bearded, wearing a dressing gown, playing the harpsichord for hours in total darkness, holding conversations with people who were not present. The first episode of acute mental disturbance came in 1788, and the descriptions left by his physicians are clinically extraordinary. George talked continuously, without pause, at such speed and for such duration that he eventually lost his voice and foamed at the mouth, his speech documented as incoherent but unrelenting. He was physically agitated, appeared to hallucinate, and his urine documented by royal physicians with the kind of specificity that medical records of the era sometimes achieve, turned a dark blue-purple during episodes. That detail, the purple urine, became central to the most important reinterpretation of his condition in modern times. A 1969 paper by Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter, published in the British Medical Journal, proposed that George's symptoms were consistent with acute intermittent porphyria, a metabolic disorder affecting heme synthesis that can produce neurological and psychiatric episodes. A 2010 analysis of preserved hair samples found elevated arsenic levels, leading some researchers to argue that arsenic-containing medicines routinely given to George may have triggered or worsened porphyria attacks, a hypothesis that remains contested, with some medical historians arguing the arsenic alone could explain the symptoms and others maintaining a different psychiatric diagnosis entirely. What is not contested is the trajectory. By 1810, he broke permanently, and the Regency began. He outlived his own sanity by a decade, dying in January 1820, having been kept alive by physicians who had no reliable understanding of what had destroyed him and no tools to reverse it. Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria. He had up to 5 seizures per day. That figure, documented by court physicians and corroborated by diplomatic observers who had no incentive to exaggerate, provides the simplest possible summary of why Ferdinand I of Austria's reign from 1835 to 1848 was, in practice, the reign of the men around him. Ferdinand suffered from epilepsy of significant severity, and he also had hydrocephalus, an abnormal accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid in the brain, which gave his head a visibly enlarged appearance that formal portraiture worked hard to minimize and that written accounts were considerably less discreet about. His speech was severely impaired. Contemporaries described him as unable to sustain a coherent conversation, and the famous remark attributed to him, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings," may be apocryphal, but it became an enduring symbol of the distance between his title and his functional capacity, precisely because it captured something true about that distance, whether he said it or not. The decision to place Ferdinand on the throne, despite full knowledge of his condition, was not an accident or an oversight. It was a calculation. An emperor who could not govern, could not interfere, and so real power sat with Metternich and the State Conference, while Ferdinand provided the dynastic legitimacy that the system required. He abdicated in December 1848 during the revolutionary upheaval that swept across Europe, retired to Prague, and lived quietly for another 27 years, dying in June 1875 at age 82, which means he outlived most of the men who had governed in his name and survived into an era when the empire itself was transforming into something his incapacity had helped, inadvertently, to shape. Alexei Romanov. Photographs of Alexei show a beautiful child, wide eyes, dark hair, the kind of face that looks composed and thoughtful in formal portraits. What the photographs do not show is that any bruise on that face, any knock against a table corner, any tumble in a corridor could trigger an episode of internal bleeding that might last for days, during which he screamed continuously and could not be effectively helped by anyone. Alexei suffered from hemophilia B, also called Christmas disease, a deficiency of clotting factor IX inherited through his mother Alexandra from her grandmother Queen Victoria, who carried the gene and transmitted it to several of her descendants across the royal houses of Europe. a single genetic mutation distributed across thrones from Russia to Spain to Prussia like a slow-moving inheritance of catastrophe. During severe episodes, blood pooled into Alexei's joints, inflaming them, destroying cartilage, and leaving him temporarily crippled in addition to the pain. He was photographed being carried in the arms of a Cossack sailor named Derivenko, his legs dangling. Because he could not walk after a serious internal bleed, the heir to 300 years of Romanov rule, unable to stand on his own. Alexandra's search for relief for her son led her to Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic whose apparent ability to calm Alexei's episodes, possibly through hypnotic suggestion, reducing stress-induced vascular pressure, though the mechanism remains debated, gave him an influence over the Empress that extended into her communications with the Tsar about ministerial appointments and wartime policy. The secrecy surrounding Alexei's condition, maintained for years from the Russian public, contributed to the growing perception of an imperial family operating in a sealed world disconnected from reality. Alexei was 13 when the revolution came. He was shot alongside his family in a basement in Yekaterinburg on the 17th of July, 1918. A boy whose body had been trying to kill him since birth, finally killed by something else entirely. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. The delivery lasted so long and went so badly that the physicians attending the birth of the future German emperor in January 1859 used forceps in a way that damaged the brachial plexus, the network of nerves running from the main, spine through the shoulder, and down the arm, on the left side of the infant's body. The result was Erb's palsy, a left arm that was approximately 6 inches shorter than the right, significantly thinner in muscle mass, and capable of only very limited movement at the elbow. Wilhelm spent his entire adult life managing the concealment of this disability with a precision that bordered on obsessive. In formal portraits, he is almost invariably shown with the left hand tucked into a pocket, resting on a sword hilt, draped across his body, or otherwise positioned so that the asymmetry is minimized or invisible. The court cooperated in this concealment as a matter of policy. What makes the childhood particularly grim is the treatment applied in the attempt to remedy the arm, electric shocks delivered to the damaged limb, a device used to straighten the neck, given that Wilhelm also had torticollis, a muscular imbalance causing the head to tilt, and periodic binding of his healthy right arm to force use of the damaged left one, a practice that produced no functional improvement and must have been significantly distressing for a young child who was simultaneously being prepared for imperial rule. The historian John Roll, whose 3-volume biography of Wilhelm is the definitive scholarly treatment, has argued at length that the combination of the disability itself, the humiliation of the remediation attempts, and the relentless pressure applied by his mother, Victoria, the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria, who found her son's imperfect body a source of profound personal disappointment, produced a man of acute and poorly managed insecurity, one who compensated with aggression, posturing, and an appetite for dominance that shaped German foreign policy in the years leading to 1914. Whether the arm caused the war is an argument historians will never fully resolve. That it shaped the man who helped cause the war is considerably harder to dismiss. King João VI of Portugal. He moved the entire Portuguese court to Brazil in November 1807, roughly 15,000 people. The government, the royal treasury, the printing presses, the library loading them onto ships, and sailing ahead of Napoleon's advancing army, making Rio de Janeiro the center of a European empire in one of the more extraordinary geopolitical pivots of the 19th century. The man who made this decision was, by all contemporary diplomatic accounts, physically spectacular in his deterioration. João suffered from a chronic skin condition described in some sources as erysipelas, a bacterial infection producing inflamed, swollen, cracked skin that affected his legs and feet particularly severely, making walking painful and eventually difficult, and making personal hygiene a sustained physical challenge rather than a casual matter of routine. His weight was significant and his eating was compulsive. The most frequently repeated anecdote about him, cited widely, though its primary sourcing requires scrutiny, is that he kept roasted chicken in his coat pockets and ate while walking between rooms of the palace, grease marking the velvet of his royal garments. Diplomatic dispatches from foreign ministers describe audiences with him as olfactorily challenging experiences, accounts rendered with the careful language of people who needed to remain on good terms with the Portuguese crown, while also accurately reporting to their home governments what the crown actually looked like up close. None of this diminished his political instincts in the way that Ferdinand I of Austria's conditions diminished his. João governed, made consequential decisions, navigated Napoleon, a Brazilian independence movement, and a Portuguese constitutional revolution, and died in March 1826, still in possession of at least some of his political faculties. The gap between the grandeur of what he accomplished and the physical reality of the man who accomplished it is one of the more unexpectedly compelling contradictions in the history of European monarchy. A king whose body was visibly failing for most of his adult life, conducting an empire from inside it anyway. Zedekiah, king of Judah. Zedekiah was the last king of Judah, and the manner of his ending was designed not merely to kill him but to break him completely before he died. When Nebuchadnezzar, the second of Babylon, installed him as a puppet ruler in Jerusalem, Zedekiah swore an oath of loyalty to the Babylonian Empire, an oath backed by the full religious and political weight of the ancient Near East. He broke it anyway, reaching out to Egypt for military support and triggering one of the most devastating sieges in the ancient world. When Jerusalem's walls finally fell in 586 BC, Zedekiah fled under cover of darkness with what remained of his army, heading toward the plains of Jericho. But Babylonian forces were faster. They ran him down in the open country and dragged him before Nebuchadnezzar at his military headquarters at Riblah. What happened next was not an execution, at least not immediately. It was theater, constructed for maximum psychological devastation. Nebuchadnezzar had Zedekiah's sons brought forward one by one and killed in front of their father. A deliberate, methodical process that ended an entire royal bloodline, while the man responsible for that bloodline was forced to watch. Then, while those images were still fresh and burning behind Zedekiah's eyes, his captors put out those eyes entirely. He was blinded on the spot, the very last thing he ever saw in his life being the deaths of his children. The sequence was not accidental, it was the point. After the blinding, he was bound in bronze shackles and transported to Babylon, where he spent the remainder of his life in prison. The account appears in both 2 Kings and Jeremiah, and it is corroborated well enough by Babylonian imperial records of the period that historians treat it as broadly reliable. The mutilation served a dual function that ancient conquerors understood intuitively. A blinded former king posed no military threat, could not rally supporters, could not command armies, and could not perform the visual, ceremonial functions that gave kingship its legitimacy in the ancient world. At the same time, keeping him alive and imprisoned turned him into a permanent monument to Babylonian power, a breathing reminder to anyone tempted toward rebellion of exactly what awaited them. Ramesses III and the Harem Conspiracy, circa 1155 BC. Ramesses III was one of ancient Egypt's most celebrated warrior pharaohs, the man who repelled the Sea Peoples and kept Egypt intact during one of the ancient world's most chaotic periods of collapse, and he was murdered in his own bedroom by members of his own household. The conspiracy was organized by one of his secondary wives, Tia, who wanted to place her son Pentawere on the throne, and it involved a remarkably broad network of palace officials, military officers, and servants, enough that its exposure generated one of the longest surviving judicial records from ancient Egypt, the Judicial Papyrus of Turin. For a long time, the actual method of the assassination remained uncertain, with the papyrus recording that a conspiracy had succeeded and that the pharaoh had died, but being coy about the precise mechanism. That changed in 2012, when a team of researchers published CT scan findings on Ramesses III's mummy in the British Medical Journal. The scans revealed a wound to the throat so deep and wide that it nearly reached the spine, consistent with a single powerful knife stroke applied with enough force to cut through muscle, cartilage, and tissue in one motion. The wound had been packed with linen during the mummification process and concealed beneath the mummy's bandaging, which is why it had gone undetected for so long. Even more striking, the same scans found that the mummy's left thumb had been severed and was being held in place only by the bandages, a detail consistent with a defensive wound from someone raising their hands against a blade. In Egyptian cosmology, the body's physical integrity was directly tied to the soul's ability to function in the afterlife, which meant that mutilating a pharaoh's body was not merely physical desecration, but an attack on his eternal existence. The conspiracy ultimately failed to place Pentawere on the throne. The ringleaders were executed or forced to commit suicide, and Pentawere himself died under circumstances the papyrus records without much sympathy. But the pharaoh who built temples, won battles, and held Egypt together ended with a severed thumb and a cut throat, hidden under linen for 3,000 years. Justinian II, Byzantine Emperor. Rhinote Matos. The Byzantine Empire had an elegant solution to the problem of deposed rulers who might stage a comeback. It wrote physical perfection into the job requirements. An emperor was supposed to be whole and unblemished,
a reflection of divine order, which meant that cutting off a rival's nose was technically a constitutional procedure as much as an act of cruelty. Justinian II discovered this policy from the receiving end in 695 AD, when his own nobles, exhausted by his erratic and increasingly brutal rule, rose against him, dragged him from the palace, and had his nose removed, a procedure called rhinotomy, performed with a blade right there in Constantinople. The intention was permanent retirement. A noseless man could not be emperor. He was exiled to Crimea, his face mutilated, his reign apparently finished, and history was supposed to move on. Justinian refused to cooperate with this plan. In exile, he cultivated relationships with the Khagan of the Khazars, eventually marrying the Khagan's sister, and then turned to Tervel, the Bulgarian Khan, offering him the title of Caesar and a mountain of tribute in exchange for military support. In 705 AD, Justinian II marched back to Constantinople at the head of a Bulgarian army, found a way into the city through an old water pipe under the walls, according to some accounts, and reclaimed his throne 10 years after his nose had been cut off, specifically to prevent him from ever doing that. He had, somewhere along the way, replaced the missing nose with a solid gold prosthetic, which he apparently wore openly, a piece of gilded defiance that announced to everyone looking at him that the mutilation meant to end his reign had instead become his most memorable feature. His name in the historical record is Rhinotmetos, literally the slit-nosed, and it has followed him through 14 centuries. His second reign was, if anything, more brutal than his first, characterized by mass executions and the settling of old scores, until 711 AD when he was finally captured and killed, this time without the option of exile. The gold nose did not survive him, but the story did, and it remains one of the most extraordinary comebacks in the history of monarchy, a man who turned his own disfigurement into a crown. Edward II of England. Edward II managed to alienate virtually every powerful constituency in medieval England simultaneously. The nobility resented his reliance on favorites. The church grew impatient with his governance, and his own wife, Isabella of France, eventually had enough and left the country to organize his removal from the outside. She returned in 1326 with her lover Roger Mortimer and an invading force, and Edward's support evaporated almost immediately. He was captured, forced to abdicate in January 1327 inches, one of the most humiliating ceremonies in English royal history, watching his 14-year-old son proclaimed king while he sat stripped of everything. He was imprisoned first at Kenilworth, and then moved to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, where conditions reportedly deteriorated deliberately, with accounts describing attempts to weaken him through cold, damp, and poor food without leaving obvious marks of abuse. He was dead by the 21st of September 1327. The official explanation was grief. Contemporary chroniclers told a different story, with multiple sources describing a killing method selected with specific and gruesome intentionality. A red-hot iron inserted through a horn tube into his bowels, destroying him internally while leaving no external wound for a coroner to find. Whether this account is accurate is genuinely disputed among modern historians. Christopher Marlowe embedded it in his 1592 play and cemented it in the popular imagination. But some scholars argue the story emerged and grew over decades and may be embellishment. What complicates the picture further is the Fieschi Letter of 1337, a document in which a papal notary claims that Edward escaped Berkeley Castle, lived as a hermit in Europe, and eventually died in Italy, which would mean the body buried as Edward II was someone else entirely. The letter is real. Its contents are contested. What is not seriously contested is that a king of England died at Berkeley Castle under circumstances that his own government found it useful not to examine too closely, and that the manner of his dying, whatever it actually was chosen to be undetectable. That deliberate hiddenness is its own kind of horror. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart arrived at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire on the morning of the 8th of February 1587, dressed in black over a crimson-red petticoat, the Catholic color of martyrdom. Having spent the previous night in prayer and apparent calm, she was 44 years old and had been a prisoner of her cousin Elizabeth I for nearly 19 years. Her execution finally authorized, after evidence of her involvement in the Babington plot, a scheme to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne. The scaffold had been erected in the Great Hall, draped in black, and several hundred witnesses had been permitted entry, because Elizabeth's government wanted this death to be public and unambiguous. Mary conducted herself with complete composure throughout the ceremony, even smiling at one point, which unnerved the witnesses considerably. Then the executioner raised his axe. The first blow missed the neck almost entirely, striking the back of the skull with enough force to stagger her, but not enough to kill. She was still alive and reportedly whispered something, accounts vary on what,
before the second blow came down and cut most of the way through the neck, but again failed to complete the job. The third blow finally severed the head. The executioner then reached down to lift it by the hair for the traditional display, and the head dropped, because what he had grabbed was Mary's wig. Beneath it, her real hair was cut short and entirely gray, a detail that jolted the room, because the queen they had seen walk in had appeared dark-haired and composed, and what lay on the scaffold was suddenly much older and more vulnerable. Then her small dog, a Skye Terrier that had been concealed under her skirts the entire time, crept out and lay between her severed head and her body, refusing to move. The executioner and his assistant had to physically carry it away. The 3 axe blows are attested by multiple eyewitness accounts, with enough consistency to be treated as reliable, and the detail of the wig and the dog appears in several independent contemporary reports. It is one of the most thoroughly documented executions in history, and also one of the most disastrous in its execution. Vlad II Dracul and Vlad III, Vlad the Impaler, the Wallachian pattern. The House of Draculesti produced 2 of the most violently ended royal figures in Eastern European history within a single generation, and the way the father died may explain almost everything about what the son became. Vlad II Dracul, ruler of Wallachia in the 1440s, operated in the impossible position between the Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north, paying tribute to both when necessary and lying to both when useful. In 1447, the Wallachian boyars, the noble class who had always held the real levers of power, moved against him with Hungarian backing. They captured him, blinded him with hot irons, and buried him alive near Balteni, an end that was brutal even by the standards of a century that had seen considerable brutality. His son Vlad III, the future impaler, had been held as an Ottoman hostage since around 1442, a child of roughly 11 years old delivered to the court of Murad II as a guarantee of his father's loyalty. He spent years in Ottoman captivity, learning Turkish and reportedly enduring various forms of mistreatment before being released, only to discover that his father had been overthrown and murdered and his elder brother Mircea had been blinded and buried alive as well. The same method applied to the entire line. Vlad III eventually reclaimed the Wallachian throne through a combination of Ottoman and Hungarian support at different points, and he ruled with an appetite for impalement, specifically that historians have long connected to his years of political powerlessness and the manner of his family's destruction. He was himself killed in battle near Bucharest in either late 1476 or early 1477, the exact date remaining disputed, and his head was removed and sent to Constantinople, where Sultan Mehmed II had it displayed on a stake as confirmation of the death of the man who had been one of the Ottomans' most troublesome opponents. The family story across 2 generations is essentially a closed loop of mutilation. Father blinded and buried, brother blinded and buried, son became a monster, monster beheaded and displayed. Al-Qahir, Abbasid Caliph. The Abbasid Caliphate in its later centuries developed an institutional practice for handling unwanted caliphs that was, in its own way, almost bureaucratic in its consistency. Outright killing a caliph carried religious and political risks that blinding did not, since a blind man could not lead Friday prayers, could not command armies in the field, and could not perform the ceremonial functions that legitimized the caliphate. Blinding was therefore not merely cruelty, but a formal mechanism of political neutralization, applied with enough regularity across the 9th and 10th centuries that it became essentially standard operating procedure for the Buyid commanders who held the real power behind the throne. Al-Qahir, who ruled from 929 to 934 AD, provides the most documented example of the practice in action. He had come to the throne through violence himself, having his predecessor and brother al-Muqtadir killed, and he ruled with enough paranoia and erratic cruelty that his own court eventually decided he had to go. In 934 AD, he was deposed by a coalition of officers and courtiers, and the blinding was carried out with hot irons applied directly to the eyes in the palace in Baghdad. He was then kept alive and held for years afterward, a blind former caliph wandering the city in poverty according to some accounts, his degradation serving as a useful reminder of how completely power could be stripped away. He reportedly died around 950 AD, having spent roughly 16 years as a living symbol of deposed authority. The pattern repeated across multiple Abbasid caliphs in this period, with al-Muqtafi, al-Mustakfi, and others subjected to similar depositions. The logic was consistent and coldly practical. Death creates martyrs, but a blind beggar who used to be caliph creates something arguably more useful, a demonstration that the institution itself could survive and replace any individual, no matter how exalted. Richard II of England. Richard II's destruction was not sudden. It was methodical, extended, and designed to leave no obvious evidence of crime while achieving the same result as execution. He had been one of England's more culturally sophisticated monarchs, genuinely interested in art and architecture, a patron who reportedly insisted on the use of handkerchiefs at court and wore elaborately decorated clothing that scandalized more traditionally minded nobles. None of that mattered by 1399, when his cousin Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile with an army, and Richard's support simply dissolved around him. He surrendered at Flint Castle in August 1399 and was forced through a formal abdication ceremony on September 29, a ritual humiliation in which he was required to renounce his crown publicly before an assembly at Westminster. He was then imprisoned at the Tower of London and subsequently moved to Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, which was far enough from London that what happened there could be managed without too many witnesses. He was dead by February 1400, aged 33. The official record offers nothing specific on cause of death. The accounts that followed blamed starvation, either imposed by his captors who simply stopped providing adequate food, or voluntary, with Richard allegedly refusing to eat. The physical reality of death by starvation is slow, measured in weeks rather than days, involving the progressive consumption of the body's own muscle and fat tissue. For a man who had been known for his fashionable appearance and elaborate court presentation, the manner of the ending carried a specific additional cruelty. His body was displayed publicly in London afterward, the new Lancastrian government needing to demonstrate that Richard II was genuinely dead and not simply imprisoned somewhere, waiting for an opportunity to return. Henry V later had him reinterred at Westminster Abbey with full royal honors, possibly out of genuine respect, possibly because having a properly buried predecessor was politically tidier than an inadequately explained corpse in Yorkshire. The Romanov family, the execution of Nicholas II and his family in the basement of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg on the 17th of July 1918, was supposed to be quick. The Bolshevik Regional Command had received authorization from Moscow. The family had been told they were being moved for their safety, and Yakov Yurovsky, the regional Cheka commander overseeing the operation, had assembled a firing squad in the small basement room. Nicholas II was shot in the head and killed almost immediately. Alexandra died quickly. What followed for the children and the remaining household members was neither quick nor clean. The four daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, had sewn a significant quantity of diamonds, emeralds, and other jewels directly into the inner lining of their corsets, partly as portable wealth in case of escape, and partly because they had been doing so for months, as their situation deteriorated. When the initial volley of bullets hit them, the jewels deflected the rounds, and the girls did not die. Witnesses described a scene of chaos and horror, smoke filling the small room, the noise disorienting, the girls still moving on the floor despite having been shot multiple times. Yurovsky's own account, which survived in Soviet archives and was made public after the fall of the Soviet Union, describes the soldiers having to use bayonets and then additional pistol shots fired at close range to finish the killings. The entire process took roughly 20 minutes, which in that basement must have felt considerably longer. The Bolsheviks' concern about martyrdom did not end with the deaths. The bodies were taken into the forest, doused with sulfuric acid, partially burned, and buried in two separate pits to make identification and recovery as difficult as possible. The main burial pit was discovered in 1991 after the Soviet collapse. A second pit containing the remains of the Tsarevich Alexei and one of the daughters, identified through DNA analysis as Maria, was found in 2007. The DNA work also definitively confirmed that all 5 children were present and accounted for, closing the door permanently on the Anastasia survival mythology that had generated imposters and stories for most of the 20th century. The physical destruction of the family was ideological as much as practical. The Bolsheviks did not merely want the Romanovs dead, they wanted them erased, their bodies dissolved and scattered so thoroughly that there would be nothing left around which devotion could organize. It did not work, but the attempt produced one of the most methodically brutal royal endings in modern history. The Aztec Tlatoani. High in the heart of Tenochtitlan, on the blood-dark steps of the Templo Mayor, the rulers of the Aztec Empire presided over something that no other civilization in the ancient world organized quite so deliberately or at quite such a scale. The Tlatoani, the supreme speaker, the god king at the apex of the Triple Alliance, did not merely tolerate cannibalism as a side effect of warfare. He institutionalized it, scheduled it, and consumed it himself as an act of divine communion. When captive warriors were brought to the sacrificial stone, their chests opened with obsidian blades dark as volcanic glass, their still-beating hearts lifted toward the sun in honor of Huitzilopochtli. What came next was not chaos. It was protocol. The bodies were carefully carried down the pyramid steps, and the flesh, specifically the thighs and upper arms, The meatiest and most prized portions was distributed according to rank, with the highest-born nobles and the Tlatoani's inner circle receiving first. The flesh was stewed in clay pots alongside maize, prepared without salt and without chili, because those seasonings were reserved for animals. The distinction was deliberate and meaningful. This was sacred food, consumed by sacred men. Estimates of the number of people sacrificed annually across the empire range from a few thousand to tens of thousands, though the upper figures remain hotly disputed among modern scholars, and the lower end is almost certainly more accurate. What is not disputed is that Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who walked through Tenochtitlan with Cortés in 1519, documented the Tzompantli, the Great Skull Rack standing near the Templo Mayor, and described it in terms that left his Spanish readers pale. The consumption itself was never casual. To eat a great warrior was understood as absorbing his strength, his fighting spirit, his accumulated courage, passing into your own body through the act of ingestion. Some scholars, most notably Michael Harner in 1977, controversially argued that the entire system was driven partly by protein deficiency in the Aztec diet, a nutritional necessity dressed in religious clothing. Mainstream archaeology has largely rejected this interpretation, pointing instead to the overwhelming cosmological logic of the system. The sun required blood and flesh to keep moving across the sky, and the Tlatoani was the man responsible for making sure it did. When the Spanish arrived and eventually dismantled Tenochtitlan stone by stone, they framed their destruction of the empire partly as a civilizing mission against this practice. The irony is that their accounts, useful as they are, were written by men who had every political reason to make the Aztecs sound as monstrous as possible. The Ratu chiefs of Fiji. On the opposite side of the world, on a chain of green islands rising from the South Pacific, Fijian, chiefly culture, developed one of the most thoroughly documented and deliberately practiced traditions of political cannibalism anywhere in the recorded historical record, and it lasted, in some form, well into the 19th century. The Ratu, the hereditary chiefs who commanded Fijian society, did not eat their enemies out of hunger or even purely out of spiritual obligation. They did it as the most complete and devastating political statement available to them. To defeat an enemy chief in battle was one thing. To consume his body in front of his surviving kin, on his own land, surrounded by his own people, was something else entirely. It was annihilation made literal, a message delivered in the most visceral possible terms about who now held power and what that power meant. Fijian society maintained specialist roles, designated men responsible for the preparation and cooking of bodies, and the feasts themselves were tied to significant political transitions, major military victories, the funerals of important chiefs, and the installation of new rulers. The most extreme individual case in the historical record belongs to Ratu Udre Udre, a 19th century chief from the Ra province on Viti Levu, who is recorded in oral tradition as having consumed somewhere between 872 and 999 people over his lifetime, keeping a stone for each victim in a pile beside his compound. His grave and the associated stone collection are reportedly still visible in Rocky Rocky. That figure comes from oral tradition rather than written documentation and should be treated as a historical claim rather than a verified statistic, but it was significant enough that Guinness World Records has cited it. What is not disputed at all is the 1,867 killing of Reverend Thomas Baker, a British Methodist missionary who made the fatal mistake of removing a comb from a chief's hair, an act of profound disrespect in Fijian custom, and was subsequently killed and eaten along with his companions. Even his leather boots were reportedly thrown into the cooking fire, though they proved too tough to eat. In 2003, Baker's descendants received a formal apology from the Fijian government, delivered in a traditional ceremony, acknowledging that the killing had brought spiritual consequences the community still felt. The conversion of Fiji to Christianity under sustained missionary and colonial pressure effectively ended the practice by the close of the 19th century, but for roughly 2 centuries before that, it was a cornerstone of how the Ratu maintained political authority not as barbarism, but as statecraft. The Khmer Royal Court. Built from gray sandstone dragged across the Cambodian plain, the temples of Angkor represent one of the most sophisticated civilizations the medieval world produced, and the god kings who ruled the Khmer Empire from those temple complexes, the Deva Raja, the divine king, literally the king who was a god operated within a ritual framework so extreme that almost nothing was considered beyond their sacred authority. What makes the Khmer case difficult to assess is the thinness of the direct evidence. The most frequently cited primary source is Zhou Daguan, a Chinese diplomat who spent roughly a year at the Angkor court between 1296 and 1297, and wrote a detailed account of what he observed. His text references ritual practices that some historians have interpreted as involving consumption of specific substances from the royal body or from defeated enemies as part of succession ceremonies, though the translation and interpretation of the relevant passages remain genuinely contested among scholars, and it would be dishonest to present this as settled fact. What the archaeological and art historical record does confirm, unambiguously, is that the Khmer court normalized extreme ritual violence on a vast scale. The bas-reliefs at Angkor Wat stretch for nearly half a mile and depict warfare, judgment, and punishment. In meticulous carved detail, this was a civilization that thought deeply about what the body could mean as a political and spiritual instrument. The Devaraja system held that the king's body was literally divine, that his physical substance held cosmic power, and the question of what happened to that power when a king died or was overthrown was not merely political but metaphysical. In a system with those premises, the ritual treatment of a defeated rival king's body, including, possibly, its partial consumption to transfer his royal mana to the victor, follows a logical pattern visible across multiple cultures operating under similar cosmological assumptions. The Khmer Empire collapsed gradually through the 14th and 15th centuries under a combination of Thai military pressure, internal succession violence, and ecological stress, and the records that might have documented court ritual most precisely were lost in that collapse. What remains is partial, filtered through Chinese diplomatic observation and temple carving, and should be understood as suggestive rather than conclusive. The House of Plantagenet. Medieval England is not typically the first place that comes to mind when the subject of royal cannibalism arises, but the Plantagenet dynasty, which ruled England from Henry II's coronation in 1154 through to the end of Richard III's reign in 1485, produced at least one king whose documented behavior at the table crossed a line that even his own chroniclers found worth recording. Richard I, known across Europe as the Lionheart, was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary military figures of the 12th century, and accounts of his Third Crusade preserve a detail that has fascinated and disturbed historians ever since. The Itinerarium Peregrinorum et Gesta Regis Ricardi, a Latin chronicle of the Crusade written close to the events themselves, contains a passage describing Richard being served a dish prepared from the head of a Saracen enemy, a dark joke by his cooks, or perhaps a deliberate spectacle which Richard reportedly consumed without complaint and without apparent horror. The account is brief, possibly embellished, and comes from a text written with the explicit purpose of glorifying Richard, which makes its inclusion of this episode all the more striking. Crusade chronicles more broadly, including those covering the Siege of Marat in 1098, predating the Plantagenets, but involving the Norman noble networks from which Plantagenet culture directly descended, are explicit that Crusader forces consumed the flesh of dead Muslims and possibly their own dead during that siege, driven partly by hunger and partly, some chroniclers suggest, by deliberate psychological warfare against the local population. Albert of Aachen's chronicle is among the clearest on this point. Richard's own death in 1199 from a crossbow bolt at Châlus-Chabrol produced a final act that illustrates how thoroughly medieval royal culture understood the body as a political object. His heart was removed, separately embalmed, and buried at Rouen Cathedral, while his brain and entrails were interred at Châlus and the rest of his body at Fontevraud Abbey. The heart of a great lord was understood to carry his essence, his courage, his authority, and in that symbolic framework, the consumption of an enemy's heart by a victorious rival lord was not meaningless gore, but a comprehensible act of political absorption. The Plantagenet entry is not a story of systematic institutional cannibalism, but it is a story of a dynasty operating within a culture of ritualized violence so complete and so normalized that occasional crossing of the boundary between symbolic and literal consumption of the enemy body was treated, by contemporaries, as worth recording but not worth condemning. The Luba Kingdom. In the region of Central Africa that is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, centered around the great freshwater basin of Lake Kisale, the Luba Empire stood for roughly 4 centuries as one of the most politically sophisticated kingdoms sub-Saharan Africa produced. Its kings, the Mulapwe, a title meaning sacred ruler, were understood to be not merely political leaders, but living embodiments of divine authority. their bodies literally containing the spiritual force that held the kingdom together. Within that framework, what happened to a royal body in death or defeat carried consequences that extended far beyond the personal. Oral traditions preserved by Luba historians and later recorded by anthropologists, most notably Mary Neuter Roberts in her scholarship on Luba visual culture, describe practices in which the heart and liver of a defeated rival king were consumed by the victor as an act of legitimate spiritual transfer. The Mulopwe's power did not die with his body, but could be absorbed, claimed, redirected into the body of the new ruler who had overcome him. War medicine, known broadly as dawa, was a related practice. Royal warriors going into battle were sometimes given preparations that incorporated human blood or flesh, sanctioned and distributed through the royal hierarchy, believed to confer invincibility and ferocity in combat. The Luba also developed the Lukasa, a handheld memory board covered in beads and shells encoding complex historical and genealogical knowledge, a uniquely sophisticated archival technology that now sits in museum collections in Europe and North America, a reminder that the same civilization capable of this intellectual elegance also maintained practices that European observers found incomprehensible. The historical record here requires careful handling because Belgian colonial authorities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries used accusations of cannibalism, sometimes documented, sometimes fabricated, almost always exaggerated as political justification for the extraordinarily brutal suppression of Luba resistance and the annexation of the Congo in 1908. King Leopold II's regime in the Congo Free State killed an estimated 10 million people. The colonizers who documented Luba cannibalism were simultaneously committing atrocities that dwarfed anything they described. That context does not erase the practices, but it makes uncritical reliance on Belgian colonial sources deeply problematic, and the most reliable scholarly work on Luba ritual life treats those sources with corresponding skepticism. The Tupinamba chieftains. On the green Atlantic coast of what is now Brazil, from the state of Maranhão down toward Rio de Janeiro, the Tupinamba Confederacy of Chieftains, the Morubixaba, presiding over their villages, ran a system of ritual cannibalism so extensively documented by 16th-century European observers that it remains, to this day, among the best evidenced cases of institutionalized human consumption in world history. Hans Staden, a German gunner who was captured by the Tupinamba in 1552 and held for roughly 9 months before escaping, published his illustrated account in 1557 under the title Warhaftige Historia. It became one of the best-selling books in 16th-century Europe, its woodcut illustrations of roasting human limbs and feasting villagers burning into the European imagination. Jean de Lery, a French Calvinist missionary who lived among the Tupinamba in 1557 and 1558, published his own account in 1578, more measured than Staden's. Genuinely curious about Tupinamba cosmology and widely respected by modern anthropologists for its relative carefulness. Both men described a system in which captive enemy warriors were brought back to the village alive and held, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. During their captivity, they were fed well, given wives, allowed freedom of movement, and treated, in many respects, as guests. They knew exactly what was coming. And some accounts describe the captives composing songs about their own deaths, taunting their captors with detailed promises of the revenge their surviving kin would one day take, while their captors replied with equally detailed accounts of how they would be eaten. When the day of the ceremony arrived, it was the chief's privilege or a warrior elevated by the chief for the honor to deliver the killing blow with a carved wooden club painted red with uruku dye. The body was then divided by rank, the distribution overseen by the Morubixaba, with specific portions assigned to specific categories of people. The flesh was smoked and roasted, bones were cleaned and in some cases carved into flutes played at subsequent ceremonies, and the entire event lasted multiple days, with the whole village participating under the organizational authority of the chief. The motivation was explicitly and repeatedly described by the Tupinamba themselves to their European observers. This was revenge cosmology, a system in which you consumed your enemy to honor your own dead, to carry out justice across generations, and to complete a cycle that the universe required. It was not hunger. It was not hatred in any simple sense. It was, in its own framework, a form of grief expressed as appetite, and the chieftains who presided over it understood themselves to be fulfilling a sacred obligation to their ancestors, the Royal House of Hawaii. When Captain James Cook sailed into Kealakekua Bay on the Big Island of Hawaii in January 1779,
He was met with a reception that suggested the Hawaiians may have associated him with the god Lono, arriving at exactly the right moment in the ritual calendar on a ship whose masts resembled the crossed poles of Lono's icon. When he left and then unexpectedly returned a few weeks later after storm damage to his ship, something in that sacred framework broke. Tensions escalated rapidly, and on the 14th of February 1779, Cook was killed on the beach in a chaotic confrontation. What happened to his body afterward has been debated by historians ever since. Hawaiian chiefs did take portions of his remains. His bones were cleaned and distributed among high-ranking alii, which was the standard treatment of an honored or powerful enemy whose mana was worth preserving and claiming. Whether any consumption of flesh occurred is genuinely disputed, and responsible historians flag it as contested. What is not contested is the framework that would have made such an act meaningful if it did occur. The Ali'i Nui, the high chiefs who sat at the apex of Hawaiian society, who would within a generation be recognized as a formal royal dynasty under Kamehameha I, operated within a system in which mana, spiritual power, was the central currency of political life, and the body of a powerful person was understood to be literally saturated with it. To absorb a rival chief's mana by consuming his body was not a foreign or monstrous concept in that framework. It was a logical extension of the same spiritual economics that governed every other aspect of chiefly life. Kamehameha I, who united the Hawaiian Islands through a series of wars beginning in the 1790s and completed by roughly 1810, is associated in oral traditions with ritual acts following major military victories that fit this pattern, though the oral historical record here requires the same careful sourcing as any tradition preserved through generations of telling. The kapu system, the elaborate network of sacred prohibitions that governed Hawaiian society, including strict rules about who could eat what and in whose presence, treated food itself as a political instrument of the first order. When Kamehameha II abolished the kapu system in 1819 by publicly eating with women, an act previously forbidden under pain of death, he was not simply changing a dining rule. He was dismantling the entire cosmological structure that made his dynasty's power sacred, and within that structure, the ritual use of the body as food had been one of the most extreme expressions of chiefly authority available. The Wari of Western Brazil. In the deep rainforest of what is now the state of Rondônia in western Brazil, the Wari people, known to outsiders for most of the 20th century by the colonial name Pacá Nova, practiced a form of cannibalism that forces a complete rethinking of what the word even means, because everything about it was the opposite of what most people imagine when they encounter the subject. The Wari did not eat their enemies. They ate their own beloved dead. And they did so not out of hunger, not out of cruelty, and not out of any desire to absorb power or send a political message. They did it because they loved them, and because allowing a body to decompose in the ground, sealed away from the community, left to rot alone in the dark, was, in their understanding, the truly horrifying option. The practice was endocannibalism, the consumption of one's own group's dead as a funerary act, overseen and organized by the elder and chiefly figures who held authority within Wari social structure. The body of a deceased community member was prepared and shared at a funeral feast, with the participation of relatives and community members understood as the most complete possible expression of grief and love, a refusal to abandon the dead person, a final act of incorporation that kept them, literally, within the living community. Beth Conklin, an anthropologist who conducted extensive fieldwork with the Wari and published her findings in Consuming Grief in 2001 through the University of Texas Press, provides the most detailed and carefully sourced account available. What makes her work particularly remarkable is that it includes the voices of elderly Wari people who remembered the practice and who described the shift to Christian burial customs imposed by Brazilian government pacification, campaigns and missionary pressure in the 1960s as one of the most painful losses their community has experienced. They describe the old practice with a complex mixture of sorrow and nostalgia, and they describe ground burial as leaving the dead alone, in a way that feels, to them, like abandonment. The chiefly and elder structure that organized the funerary feasts was not incidental to the practice, it was essential, because these were not spontaneous individual acts, but community ceremonies, requiring recognized authority to convene and conduct. The Wari case does not fit neatly into a video about powerful rulers using cannibalism as a weapon of domination, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. It fits because it demonstrates the outermost boundary of what cannibalism as a culturally organized, leadership-sanctioned practice can mean, not the most extreme expression of power over enemies, but the most extreme expression of devotion to the people you have lost. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.